I disappeared for 4 months and my parents didn't notice. Not a single phone call, not one text asking if I was okay, because they were too busy bankrolling my younger sister Madeline's struggles, which, as it turned out, was a very expensive gambling addiction they'd been hiding from me for years. But here's the thing they didn't know while they were writing checks to cover her debts and telling everyone I was too successful to need family. I was building an empire. And when my face appeared on national television as the CEO whose firm just sold for over $50 million, their phones suddenly started working again. My mother, who once humiliated me at a family dinner calling me selfish in front of everyone, left 23 voicemails in 2 days. Madeline, the golden child who could do no wrong, sent me a tearful message begging for help now that her creditors are threatening legal action. And my father, who stayed silent through 35 years of blatant favoritism, had the audacity to ask why I'm being so cold. They want to fix our relationship. They want me to come home. They want my money. What they're about to get is the truth, and it's going to cost them everything they thought they knew about their perfect family. Because I didn't just discover their lies. I discovered the devastating secret that explains why my mother has hated me my entire life. And when that comes out, there's no coming back from it. Stay with me. This story has twists you won't see coming, and an ending they'll never forget. My name is Brittany Kelly. I'm 35 years old, and until recently I spent 15 years building a career in corporate consulting that eventually led me to found my own firm. I grew up in a household where love came with conditions I could never quite meet, no matter how hard I tried. 4 months ago, I packed my life into a modest sedan and drove 11 hours to a city where no one knew my name or my history. I didn't announce my departure with a dramatic speech or a tearful goodbye. I simply stopped answering the phone as frequently. Then I stopped initiating contact altogether. Then I changed my number and didn't send the new one. The transition was so gradual that I told myself at first that I was just taking some space, that I needed time to think, that I'd reconnect when I felt stronger. But as the weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. The relief I felt far outweighed the loneliness. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up without a knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering what crisis I'd be expected to solve before noon. There were no phone calls asking me to cover rent because Madeline had unexpected expenses again. No voicemails from my mother explaining why I needed to be more understanding about my sister's latest firing or breakup or mysterious financial emergency that somehow always required my immediate intervention. The apartment I rented was nothing special. A 1-bedroom in a quiet complex with beige walls and standard fixtures, but it was mine. I'd furnished it slowly, thoughtfully, with pieces I actually liked rather than hand-me-downs from relatives who were upgrading. I bought a deep blue couch that felt like a hug. I hung art that made me smile. I filled the kitchen with ingredients for recipes I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for because I was too busy putting out fires for people who never once asked if I was drowning. The emptiness I felt wasn't the absence of family, it was the absence of chaos, and I was learning slowly to fill that space with peace instead of guilt. Back home, I knew life continued exactly as it always had. I could picture it so clearly, it was almost like watching a movie I'd seen 1,000 times. My mother would be preparing dinner, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of decades of routine. My father would be in his recliner, half watching television, half listening to whatever drama was unfolding. And Madeline, 27 years old and still living in her childhood bedroom, would be at the center of it all, her problems taking up all the oxygen in the room. "She's just going through a rough patch," my mother would say, the same phrase she'd been using for the better part of a decade. "You know how sensitive she is." Sensitive. That was the word they used to excuse everything. Madeline was too sensitive to hold down a job when her manager gave her constructive feedback. Too sensitive to maintain friendships when people expected her to reciprocate effort. Too sensitive to manage her own finances, her own schedule, her own life. And because she was sensitive, everyone else had to adjust. Everyone else had to accommodate. Everyone else had to sacrifice. Everyone else meant me. I wondered sometimes if they talked about me at all anymore. Did my name come up at dinner? Probably, but only in passing. "Brittany's always been so independent," my mother would say, and my father would nod in agreement as if independence were a character trait rather than a survival mechanism I'd developed because no one ever offered me another option. "She can handle herself." That phrase, "she can handle herself," was both a compliment and a dismissal. It meant I was capable, yes, but it also meant I didn't need anyone. It meant they didn't have to worry about me, didn't have to check in, didn't have to extend the same care and concern they showered on Madeline daily. It was permission for them to forget me wrapped in the language of admiration. And they had taken that permission and run with it. 4 months, 16 weeks, a third of a year. And not one of them had noticed I was gone. Oh, they might have noticed I wasn't answering the phone as quickly. They might have registered in some vague way that I seemed busy, but noticed that I'd left the state that I'd moved my entire life to a place where they couldn't reach me even if they tried. No, because noticing would have required them to think about me in the first place, and I had never been worth that kind of attention. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a confirmation of something I'd known on some level my entire life. I was the daughter who didn't need them, so they didn't bother to need me back. Love in the Kelly family was reserved for those who struggled, who faltered, who required saving. Competence was punished with invisibility. Tonight, like so many nights before, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror after brushing my teeth, studying my own reflection, as if I were looking at a stranger. My face looked different here, less tight, less guarded. The lines around my eyes seemed softer somehow, as if my body itself had relaxed in the absence of constant stress. I looked like someone who was sleeping through the night, someone who wasn't bracing for impact. I thought about the woman I'd been 4 months ago, packing boxes in the dark so I wouldn't have to explain myself. I thought about all the years before that, showing up for a family that never showed up for me. I thought about the version of myself who believed that if I just tried harder, gave more, asked for less, eventually they'd see me, really see me. And then I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since the day I left. Would anyone in my family even notice if I never came back? I stood there, hands gripping the cool porcelain of the sink, and let the question settle into my bones. Not with anger, not with self-pity, just with the cold, clear truth of it. The answer I already knew was no. It wasn't that they didn't call. It was that they never noticed I was gone. The absence of their notice didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how long it had taken me to see the pattern for what it really was. Sitting on my blue couch that evening, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, I found myself traveling back through memories I'd spent years trying to reframe as normal. Trying to convince myself that every family had its dynamics, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules. But ours had a script. And I'd been reading my lines for 35 years. The phrase came back to me with the clarity of a recording played on loop. "You're the older one. You need to be more understanding." My mother said it so often it became the soundtrack of my childhood. When Madeline broke my favorite doll and I cried, my mother knelt down and delivered the line with gentle firmness, as if she were teaching me an important life lesson. When Madeline threw a tantrum because I got to sit in the front seat and she didn't, I was the one who had to give up my place. When we both wanted the last piece of cake, the last choice of television show, the last word in an argument, I was the one expected to step aside. Not because it was fair, not because it was my turn to sacrifice, but because I was the older one, and understanding was my job. At first, I thought it meant I was mature, special even. I wore the responsibility like a badge of honor, proud that my mother trusted me to be the reasonable one. But as I grew older, the phrase evolved. It wasn't just about sharing toys anymore. It was about sharing my parents' attention, their resources, their love. And the sharing, I began to realize, only went one direction. When I was 14 and Madeline was 6, I saved up babysitting money for months to buy a guitar I'd been dreaming about. The day I brought it home, Madeline decided she wanted to learn to play too. My mother suggested I teach her share the guitar until we could afford another one. I agreed, wanting to be the good sister, the understanding one. Madeline lost interest within 2 weeks, but not before she'd scratched the finish and broken 2 strings. When I got upset, my mother looked at me with disappointment. "She's just a child, Brittany. You're the older one. You need to be more understanding." The guitar sat in the corner of my room, damaged and half-forgotten, a physical reminder that my wants were always secondary. When I was 17 and got accepted to my dream college, my parents sat me down with serious faces. Money was tight, they explained. Madeline was struggling in school and needed tutoring, possibly private school if things didn't improve. Would I consider the state university instead? It was closer, cheaper, and I was so smart that I'd succeed anywhere. I swallowed my disappointment and nodded. I chose the state school. Madeline got her private school and dropped out halfway through sophomore year because she didn't connect with the other students. No one ever said, "Madeline, you're old enough now. You need to be more understanding." The standard that governed my life never applied to her. She was allowed to be selfish, impulsive, irresponsible. She could quit jobs because the hours were inconvenient. She could move back home in her 20s because finding yourself takes time. She could borrow money and never pay it back because she's going through something. Every failure was reframed as a journey. Every tantrum was honored as emotional authenticity. Meanwhile, I was expected to have my life together by 18. I was expected to know what I wanted, work for it quietly, and never complain when my goals were deprioritized for Madeline's comfort. My successes were acknowledged with a brief nod. "Well, of course you did well, you always do," as if achievement were my baseline rather than my effort. My struggles were invisible. The one time I broke down crying in front of my mother about the stress of work and graduate school, she listened for perhaps 30 seconds before her phone rang. It was Madeline calling about some minor inconvenience. My mother took the call and I dried my tears alone. I learned over time that love in my family was not unconditional. It was a transaction. I could be loved if I required nothing. I could be valued if I gave everything. I could belong if I made myself small enough that my presence never disrupted the careful ecosystem that revolved around Madeline's needs. The inequity wasn't a single wound. It was 1,000 small cuts delivered over decades until I bled out without anyone noticing the stains. Sitting in my quiet apartment, I felt something shift inside me. A question I had never allowed myself to ask suddenly demanded an answer. If love only exists when I'm giving, sacrificing, stepping aside, what happens when I stop? Do I stop being their daughter? Was I ever really their daughter in the way Madeline was, unconditionally and completely? Or was I always just the supporting character in someone else's story, valued only for my utility? The question terrified me because I already knew the answer. These 4 months of silence had proven it. Without my labor, my money, my emotional support, I ceased to exist in their world. They didn't wonder where I was or if I was okay. They simply redirected the energy they would have spent asking me for things toward managing without me. I wasn't missed. I was replaced by the vacuum I left behind. And that vacuum, I was learning, was more peaceful than my presence had ever been. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn the kind of love Madeline received by birthright. The impossible math of it. How no amount of success, responsibility, or self-sacrifice ever added up to the same value as her need. I'd been working from a rigged equation, one where I could never be enough because enough wasn't the goal. The goal was to keep giving until there was nothing left. I set my tea down, now cold, and stared at my hands. These hands had signed checks to cover Madeline's rent, had typed countless emails to my mother reassuring her I was fine so she wouldn't worry, had held my own grief and exhaustion so tightly that no one ever had to witness it. These hands were tired. That was when I realized love shouldn't feel like debt. It shouldn't feel like a contract with terms I never negotiated. It shouldn't require me to erase myself to make room for someone else's chaos. Real love, I was beginning to understand, didn't come with that price. I started keeping a mental ledger the week after that realization, not because I wanted ammunition, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what I'd given. The numbers were worse than I'd remembered. The first transfer I could recall with absolute clarity was 9 years ago. I was 26, 3 years into my consulting career, finally starting to build savings after paying off my student loans ahead of schedule. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight with stress. Madeline had lost her retail job, something about attendance issues, though the details were vague and couldn't make rent. She was going to be evicted. Could I help just this once, just until Madeline got back on her feet? I transferred $800 that evening. My mother called the next day, relief evident in her voice, and added something that would become a familiar refrain. "Don't mention this to Madeline, sweetheart. You know how proud she is. She'd be mortified if she knew you had to bail her out." I thought I was being kind, protecting my sister's dignity, preserving family peace. The requests continued. 6 months later, another job lost another rent payment due. Then it was a car repair Madeline couldn't afford. Then my mother's dental work that insurance didn't cover. Then Madeline's credit card debt that had somehow ballooned to $4,000. Each time the ask came with the same instruction: "Don't tell Madeline. Don't make a big deal of it. Let's keep this between us." Over the course of a decade, I calculated I'd sent somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. Maybe more. I'd stopped tracking at some point, the transfers becoming so routine they blurred together. $1,000 here for an emergency room visit, $1,500 there for a security deposit on yet another apartment, $500 to cover utilities about to be shut off, $3,000 when Madeline's car was repossessed and she needed a down payment on a used replacement. None of it was ever acknowledged at family gatherings. When relatives asked how Madeline was managing, my mother would smile and say something about how she was learning to be independent or figuring things out. My father would nod approvingly, as if Madeline's basic survival was evidence of admirable growth. And I would sit there silent, watching my financial support be erased from the narrative as completely as if it had never existed. The erasure wasn't accidental. I understood that now. By instructing me to keep quiet about the money, my mother ensured that Madeline never had to feel indebted to me. More than that, it allowed my parents to continue believing in the story they'd constructed Madeline as the struggling but resilient daughter, making her way in a difficult world, supported only by their emotional encouragement. And me as the self-sufficient success who needed nothing from anyone. The irony was brutal. I was financially supporting the very narrative that excluded me. But the money was only part of it. The deeper pattern was about visibility itself. Somewhere along the way, my family had stopped asking me how I was doing. Not in the casual greeting card way, but in any meaningful sense. When we talked on the phone, the conversations followed a script. My mother would update me on Madeline's latest crisis, a fight with a roommate, a health scare that turned out to be nothing, some minor setback that consumed hours of discussion. Then she'd ask me almost as an afterthought, "And how are you?" Before I could answer with anything substantive, she'd continue, "You're doing well, I'm sure. You always land on your feet." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A conclusion she'd already reached that required no input from me. And because I didn't want to be needy, didn't want to burden them, didn't want to compete with Madeline's endless disasters for attention, I'd confirm it. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Work's busy, but good." Fine. Busy. Good. The words became armor, a way to end the conversation before it could reveal anything true. The perverse logic of it took years to fully understand. The better I did, the less they checked on me. My competence, which I'd cultivated partly to make them proud and partly to avoid becoming another problem they had to solve, became the justification for their neglect. When I got promoted to senior consultant, my mother's response was a brief, "That's wonderful, honey," before pivoting immediately to Madeline's struggles with her new manager. When I started my own firm, risking everything I'd built on a venture that terrified me, my father's only comment was, "You've always been good with business." No curiosity about the details. No questions about whether I was scared or stressed or needed advice. Just the bland assumption that I had it handled because I always did. They didn't celebrate my successes because success was my baseline. They didn't support my struggles because I'd never been given permission to struggle. I existed in their minds as a fixed entity, Brittany, the capable one who required no maintenance, no concern, no care. I was not a daughter. I was a resource. And I had allowed it. That was perhaps the hardest part to accept. I'd enabled this dynamic by never demanding more, never refusing a request, never insisting that my contributions be acknowledged. I told myself I was being mature, being the bigger person rising above pettiness. I told myself that keeping the peace was worth the personal cost. But peace for whom? Not for me. I lived with chronic stress, checking my bank account nervously, before every family phone call, wondering what emergency would require my intervention next. I lived with resentment I couldn't express, gratitude I never received, and a growing hollowness where connection should have been. The peace I'd been preserving was theirs. My mother got to feel like a good parent to Madeline without confronting the enabling. My father got to remain comfortably distant from conflict. Madeline got to continue her chaotic life without consequences. And I got to be the invisible support beam holding up a structure that would collapse without me receiving neither recognition nor rest. Sitting in my apartment reviewing the bank statements I'd pulled from my files, I felt something cold and clarifying settle over me. This wasn't a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or communication breakdowns. This was a system, a deliberately maintained architecture of roles and expectations that required my silence to function, and I had been complicit in building it. Every time I sent money without asking for acknowledgement, I reinforced the idea that my support didn't matter. Every time I said I was fine when I wasn't, I confirmed their belief that I needed nothing. Every time I absorbed their dysfunction without complaint, I proved I could handle more. I thought silence was kindness. I was wrong. The clarity I'd gained about my family's dysfunction should have been liberating, but instead, it left me restless. I found myself unable to settle into my usual evening routine. I paced my apartment, made tea, I didn't drink, opened a book I couldn't focus on. Finally, around 9 o'clock, I turned to a task I'd been avoiding for months, unpacking the last 3 boxes stacked in my bedroom closet. These weren't boxes from my recent move. They were remnants from years ago, items I'd taken from my childhood bedroom during my last visit home, back when I still believed distance might make the relationship healthier rather than impossible. I'd packed them hastily, shoving in yearbooks, old journals, photographs, and mementos without much thought. They'd followed me through 2 apartments before this one unopened. A therapist might say I was avoiding confronting my past. She'd probably be right. But tonight, riding the momentum of uncomfortable truths, I pulled the first box down and cut through the packing tape. Most of it was predictable. My high school diploma, debate team trophies, a dried corsage from prom, birthday cards from my grandmother. Her handwriting shaky but affectionate. I sorted through it methodically, making piles: keep, donate, discard. The second box yielded similar contents. But the third box, smaller and heavier than the others, contained something different. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a family photo album I didn't recognize. The leather cover was worn, the binding cracked. When I opened it, the smell of old paper and darkroom chemicals wafted out a scent that belonged to an era before digital photography. The early pages showed my parents as a young couple, impossibly young, my mother's hair dark and long, my father lean and smiling in a way I'd rarely seen. I flipped through slowly, watching my parents age in increments. Wedding photos, a picture of them in front of their first house. My mother pregnant, her hand resting on a small bump, and then a series of photos of a little girl I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 2 or 3 years old, with light brown hair cut in a short bob. She wore a yellow sundress, in one photo holding a stuffed rabbit. In another, she was laughing, her face tilted toward the camera, eyes bright with uncomplicated joy. There was something familiar about her features, but I couldn't immediately place it. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandmother's distinctive looping handwriting, was written a single name and a date: Sarah, June 1987. My hand froze. Sarah. The sister I'd known about in the vague, peripheral way children understand family history they're never directly told. I knew she had existed. I knew she had died young. But those were the only facts I possessed. The subject of Sarah was a forbidden territory in our household, marked by a silence so absolute, it felt religious. No one spoke her name. No photographs of her were displayed. It was as if she'd been carefully excised from family memory, leaving only an absence shaped like grief. As a child, I'd asked about her once, maybe twice. I remembered my mother's face going pale, her voice turning sharp. "We don't talk about that, Brittany." My father had simply left the room. I learned quickly that Sarah was a wound too raw to touch even decades after it had been inflicted. Out of respect, or perhaps fear, I never asked again. But now, holding this photograph, I looked at Sarah's face with adult eyes and felt something cold slide down my spine. She looked like me. Not in a general sibling resemblance way. She looked exactly like me. The shape of her eyes slightly almond and set wide apart. The serious set of her mouth even while smiling. The way her head tilted just slightly to the left, a habit I'd seen in photographs of myself at the same age. Even the texture of her hair, fine and stubbornly straight, matched my own childhood pictures. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo my grandmother had sent me years ago, a picture of me at around 3 years old, sitting in the same backyard I recognized from Sarah's photo. I held the two images side by side. We could have been the same child. If someone had shown me these photos without context, I would have assumed they were both of me taken perhaps weeks apart. The resemblance was uncanny, unsettling. I stared at Sarah's face, and it was like looking at a ghost of myself, a version of me that had existed before I was born, a life that ended before mine began. A thought crept into my mind, unwelcome and disturbing. When my mother looked at me, did she see Sarah? Was every milestone of my childhood a reminder of milestones Sarah would never reach? Was every achievement shadowed by the daughter who would never grow up to achieve anything at all? The idea should have evoked sympathy. My mother had lost a child. That was a grief I couldn't fathom, a pain that must have been unbearable. If seeing me brought back memories of Sarah, if my face was a daily reminder of what she'd lost, shouldn't that make her hold me closer? Shouldn't that resemblance have been precious, a gift, a way to keep some part of Sarah alive? But that wasn't what happened. My mother didn't hold me closer. She held me at arm's length. She looked at me with something I'd never been able to name, something that lived in the space between love and tolerance. When Madeline was born 8 years after me, that unnamed thing shifted. My mother bloomed with Madeline in a way she never had with me. She was warmer, softer, more present. Madeline looked nothing like me. She had my father's features, his darker coloring, his rounded face. She was her own person, untethered to any ghost. I sat on my bedroom floor, Sarah's photograph in one hand, my phone in the other, and felt pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving begin to click into place. I didn't have all the pieces yet. I didn't understand the full picture. But I knew with sudden certainty that Sarah's death and my mother's coldness toward me were connected. The resemblance wasn't a comfort. It was a curse. I tucked the photograph carefully into the drawer of my nightstand, unable to throw it away but unwilling to look at it any longer. My hands were shaking slightly. The room felt too small, the air too close. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cool glass, looking out at the parking lot below, at the ordinary scene of people coming home from work, living their uncomplicated lives. Somewhere in the silent architecture of my family's dysfunction, Sarah was the cornerstone, the unspoken foundation upon which everything else had been built. And I, born 2 years after her death, carrying her face like a borrowed mask, had been paying for a tragedy I had nothing to do with. I looked exactly like the daughter they lost. But instead of loving me more, they loved me less. The discovery of Sarah's photograph stayed with me like a bruise I kept pressing, checking if it still hurt. It did. But life continued, and 3 weeks later, I received an email from my Aunt Linda about the annual Kelly family reunion. It was a tradition that stretched back decades, hosted rotating among relatives this year at my parents' house. The email was cheerful and inclusive, addressed to 24 family members, reminding everyone to bring a side dish and arrive by 5. I almost didn't go. My finger hovered over the delete button for a full minute. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity about whether anyone would acknowledge my months of absence. Maybe it was a stubborn refusal to let them erase me completely. Or maybe on some level I wasn't ready to admit I wanted to see if this time would be different. I drove the 11 hours back, arriving at my parents' house just as the sun began its descent. Cars lined the street, evidence of a gathering already in full swing. I could hear laughter and conversation spilling from the backyard before I even reached the front door. My mother answered, surprise flickering across her face before she recovered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Brittany, you made it. Come in, everyone's out back." No hug, no "we missed you" or "I'm so glad you're here." Just a brisk direction toward the party, as if I were a slightly late guest rather than her daughter who hadn't been home in months. The backyard was exactly as I remembered. String lights hung between trees, long tables covered with checkered cloths, the same folding chairs that came out every year. My aunts and uncles clustered in familiar groups, cousins chasing children across the lawn. The scene was warm, nostalgic. Norman Rockwell, perfect. I grabbed a plate and filled it with food I didn't want, using the task as a shield. A few relatives greeted me with friendly warmth. Uncle Jim asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested for about 30 seconds before someone called him away. Aunt Linda hugged me and said I looked thin, which I knew was her way of expressing concern. Cousin Rachel updated me on her kids, talking for 10 minutes without asking a single question about my life. I found a seat at the end of one of the long tables, positioned where I could observe without being central. Madeline held court at the other end, animated and loud, telling some story that had people laughing. She looked the same as always, maybe a little more tired around the eyes, but still the center of gravity. Dinner progressed with the usual rhythm. My father carved a ham, dishes were passed, wine flowed. Conversations overlapped in that pleasant chaos of family gatherings. I contributed when spoken to, smiled at appropriate moments, and slowly felt myself disappearing into the background, just another piece of furniture. Then, during a lull after dessert had been served, my mother stood at the head of the table. She tapped her wineglass with a fork, calling for attention, in that way she had of commanding a room without raising her voice. "I just want to say how wonderful it is to have everyone here." She began, her voice warm with the particular effect she reserved for public moments. "Family is everything, isn't it? And I'm so grateful for my girls." "Here it comes," I thought, recognizing the setup. "You know, people always ask me what it's like having 2 daughters who are so different." She laughed, and a few people chuckled along. "Brittany, my oldest, she's always been the successful one. Independent, driven, doesn't need anyone, really. She's off building her empire, too busy for her old mother most of the time." The words were delivered with a smile, a light tone that suggested affectionate teasing, but I heard the blade beneath them. Around the table I saw heads nodding sympathetic glances toward my mother. "And then there's Madeline." She continued, placing a hand on my sister's shoulder. "Madeline values family above everything. She's here always, even when things are hard for her. She knows what matters. Career isn't everything, is it?" The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Success equals selfishness. Presence equals virtue. I had been weighed on my mother's scale and found morally wanting, and she had delivered the verdict in front of everyone who mattered. My face burned. I felt every eye at that table on me, assessing, judging, accepting the narrative my mother had just constructed. Aunt Linda looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Uncle Jim focused intently on his pie. Cousin Rachel glanced at me with something that might have been pity. No one spoke up. No one said, "That's not fair," or "Brittany's allowed to live her own life," or "Maybe there's more to the story." They simply absorbed my mother's words as truth, or at least chose not to challenge them publicly. The anger that rose in me was different from anything I'd felt before. It was cold, clear, clarifying. I understood in that moment exactly what was happening. My mother wasn't just favoring Madeline, she was actively rewriting my character, transforming my achievements into character flaws, my independence into abandonment. And she was doing it publicly, enlisting the family as witnesses to her version of events. This wasn't about Madeline anymore. This was about control. About punishing me for having the audacity to be successful, to not need them to exist outside the narrative they'd written for me. I set my fork down carefully, stood up slowly. My mother was still talking something about how family always comes first when I interrupted quietly. "Excuse me, I need to get going. Long drive." My mother blinked momentarily, thrown off script. "Oh, you're leaving already. You just got here." "I have work in the morning," I lied. "Thanks for having me." I didn't wait for a response. I walked through the house, collected my purse from the entry table, and made it to my car before anyone could follow. My hands shook as I started the engine. I half expected someone to come after me to ask if I was okay to apologize. No one came. I drove away from that house, from that family, from that version of myself who kept hoping things would change. The tears didn't come until I was on the highway, and even then they were brief. What I felt more than sadness was a devastating clarity. They would never see me, not the real me. I would always be the successful daughter who didn't need anyone, the ungrateful one who left the cold one who chose career over family. No amount of evidence to the contrary would matter, because they needed me to be that person. It justified their neglect, excused their favoritism, made sense of a system that had never made sense. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the drive. I didn't look. I knew they wouldn't be apologies. They'd be confused messages asking why I'd left so abruptly, why I was being so sensitive, why I couldn't take a joke. That night, I didn't argue. I withdrew, and they didn't even notice. I made it back to my apartment around 3 a.m, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I sat on my couch in the dark, still wearing the dress I'd put on for the reunion, and stared at nothing. My phone continued its periodic buzzing on the coffee table. I'd glanced at it once during a gas station stop. The messages were exactly what I'd predicted. My mother asking if I was upset about something, Madeline wondering why I'd run off, Aunt Linda checking if I'd gotten home safely. Not one of them acknowledged what had actually happened. The days that followed were a study in paralysis. I went through the motions of work, took calls with clients, reviewed contracts, but my mind was elsewhere, circling the same question over and over: what now? The weight of it pressed down on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about being angry at my family or feeling hurt. This was about confronting a choice that felt in some fundamental way like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught about who I was supposed to be. I'd grown up in a world where family loyalty wasn't just valued, it was sacred. The women in my family, going back generations, had endured difficult marriages, impossible situations, ungrateful children, and they'd done it with their heads held high because that's what good women did. They sacrificed. They persevered. They never, ever walked away. My grandmother used to tell a story about her own mother who'd stayed with an alcoholic husband through decades of hardship, raising 6 children, essentially alone, and was praised at her funeral as a saint. "Family is everything," my grandmother would say, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You stand by your people no matter what." I'd absorbed that lesson so deeply it had become part of my moral framework. Good daughters didn't abandon their parents. Good daughters didn't put their own needs first. Good daughters certainly didn't cut contact, didn't refuse to answer calls, didn't choose their own peace over family obligation. And if I did those things, what did that make me? The fear of judgment was crushing. I could already hear what people would say. My mother would tell everyone that she was getting older, that her health was declining conveniently, forgetting that she'd been claiming health crises for years, most of which evaporated the moment she got what she wanted. She'd position herself as the abandoned mother, bewildered by her daughter's cruelty. Relatives would shake their heads in sympathy. "After everything your mother did for you," they'd say, not knowing that the equation had always been one-sided. I'd become the villain in a story I didn't write, and there would be no way to defend myself without looking petty, vindictive, small. But there was something else beneath the fear, something that kept me awake at night with a different kind of dread. What if I was wrong? What if my perception was skewed, my memories unreliable? What if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too focused on old wounds that I should have outgrown by now? I forced myself to review the evidence dispassionately, as if I were counseling a friend who'd come to me with this same situation. I made myself recollect specific instances not through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of fact. 3 years ago, I'd flown home on a Tuesday because my mother called saying she was in the hospital with chest pains. I'd canceled client meetings, paid for a last-minute flight, arrived at the hospital in a panic. She'd already been discharged. The chest pains were anxiety. She'd wanted to talk about Madeline's latest breakup and needed support. I'd stayed 2 days listening, comforting, and flew back having used all my sick days. My mother never acknowledged the disruption to my life. 2 years ago, I'd covered 3 months of Madeline's rent after she'd been fired from another job. The agreement was that she'd pay me back when she found new work. She never did. When I gently mentioned it 6 months later, my mother had gotten angry with me for keeping score and making Madeline feel bad. 18 months ago, I'd spent my Christmas bonus on my mother's dental work that she claimed wasn't covered by insurance. I later learned from my father in an unguarded moment that it was covered. She'd just wanted the expensive cosmetic option her plan didn't include. Instance after instance, year after year, the pattern was identical. I showed up, I gave, I sacrificed, and my efforts disappeared into a void of non-acknowledgement, while simultaneously any boundary I attempted to set was met with accusations of selfishness. If a friend told me this story, what would I say? Would I counsel her to keep trying, to give more, to hope that eventually her family would change? Or would I gently suggest that 35 years of evidence might be sufficient to draw a conclusion? The answer was obvious when I removed myself from the equation. The answer became terrifying when I applied it to my own life, because walking away meant accepting that I would be judged. It meant living with the possibility that I was making a catastrophic mistake. It meant embracing a kind of freedom that felt paradoxically like the loneliest thing in the world. What kind of person cuts off their family? The question haunted me. I'd been raised to believe that only truly damaged, selfish people did such things. Only people who lacked compassion, who couldn't forgive, who elevated their own comfort above love and duty. But there was another question, quieter but more insistent, that kept surfacing in the dark hours of the night. What kind of person stays in a relationship that is systematically destroying them? Because that's what this was doing. The constant anxiety about when the next crisis would erupt. The hypervigilance around my phone. The guilt that colored every moment of peace I tried to claim for myself. The growing resentment that poisoned my ability to trust or connect with anyone else. The exhaustion of being used and then blamed for not giving more. Staying wasn't neutral. Staying had a cost, and I was the one paying it. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to consider that self-preservation might not be the moral failing I'd been taught it was. Maybe choosing myself wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was the only honest choice left when the alternative was slow erasure. The thought was liberating and devastating in equal measure. For the first time, I considered choosing myself. And it felt like betrayal. The decision once made required action, not dramatic confrontation or tearful pronouncements, but quiet, methodical steps that would create the distance I needed. I'd spent enough time debating. Now it was time to act with the same strategic thinking I brought to my professional life. The first change was financial. I opened my banking app and reviewed the automatic transfers I'd set up over the years. There were 3 recurring payments, $200 monthly to my mother for household expenses, $150 to help with her medication copays, and a standing authorization that allowed her to request emergency transfers up to $1,000 with a single text. I'd set these up years ago to streamline the process, to make helping easier. I canceled all of them. Then I went through my transaction history, methodically identifying every one-off transfer I'd made in the past 3 years. Madeline's rent, car repairs, credit card payments, medical bills. The amounts varied, but they appeared with depressing regularity, usually preceded by a phone call that started with, "I hate to ask, but..." The total over 3 years alone was $62,000. I sat with that number for a long moment. $62,000, and not once had anyone said thank you in a way that meant anything. Not once had anyone offered to pay me back, or even acknowledged the sacrifice. I didn't announce the cessation of support. I didn't send a message explaining my decision. I simply stopped. The silence itself was the boundary. The first test came 2 weeks later. My mother texted asking me to send the usual for her prescriptions. I read the message 3 times, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, the old patterns of response pulling at me like muscle memory. She'd phrased it so casually, as if my money were an entitlement rather than a gift. The usual. As if I were a payroll department rather than her daughter. I didn't respond. I watched the message sit there unread according to my delivery settings and waited to see what would happen next. Nothing happened. She didn't follow up. She didn't call to check if I'd seen the message or if something was wrong. The request simply evaporated into silence, which told me everything I needed to know. She'd found another source, or she'd never actually needed it in the first place. 3 weeks after that, Madeline sent a long text about an unexpected bill, and could I help just this once she'd pay me back as soon as she got paid. The phrase, "just this once," was particularly galling considering I'd heard it at least 30 times in the past 5 years. Again, I didn't respond. The silence held. And in that silence, I noticed something telling. When I stopped being useful, the contact stopped too. No one called to ask how I was doing. No one texted to say hello or share a piece of news. The absence of requests meant the absence of relationship, which clarified what the relationship had always been. While maintaining this external quiet, I began the internal work of documentation. I wasn't planning litigation. I had no interest in courtrooms or legal battles, but I knew my family well enough to predict what was coming. When they finally noticed my withdrawal, there would be a narrative. I would be painted as cruel, abandoning, ungrateful. The history would be rewritten to cast me as the villain who cut off her struggling family without cause. I needed to remember the truth even if no one else would. I created a folder on my encrypted cloud storage labeled simply Records. Into it went screenshots of bank transfers, each one saved with the date and the reason given for the request. I downloaded emails organizing them chronologically. My mother asking me to cover Madeline's security deposit. Madeline promising to pay me back by the end of the month. My mother instructing me not to mention the help to spare Madeline's feelings. The emails were particularly illuminating when read in sequence. They revealed a pattern of manipulation so consistent, it might have been scripted. The requests always came with urgency. There was always a crisis, a deadline, a threat of eviction or repossession or medical disaster. And there was always the promise, explicit or implied, that this time was the last time. I wasn't gathering this evidence to hurt them. I was gathering it to protect myself from gaslighting, from the inevitable rewriting of reality that would paint my boundaries as cruelty. When my mother eventually told relatives that I'd abandoned her without warning, I would have proof that I'd been supporting her for years. When Madeline claimed I'd never helped her, I'd have records showing otherwise. This wasn't revenge, it was self-defense. The final step was the hardest, changing my contact information. I'd had the same phone number since college, the same email address since my early 20s. They were woven into the fabric of my identity, connected to every account, every contact, every aspect of my adult life. But they were also leashes my family could pull at any time. I got a new phone number through my carrier and a new email address through a secure provider. I spent 2 days methodically updating my information with work contacts, friends, professional organizations, banks, and service providers. It was tedious, exhausting work, but necessary. I provided my new contact information to exactly 9 people. My closest friend from college, 3 colleagues, I trusted my doctor, my dentist, my attorney, my financial advisor, and my assistant at work. That was it. To my assistant, I gave specific instructions. Any calls or emails from my family were to be logged but not forwarded to me. If they persisted or claimed an emergency, she was to forward the contact to my attorney's office where they could leave a message if the matter was genuinely urgent. I wasn't disappearing. I was controlling access. For the first time in my life, my family would have to go through channels to reach me, would have to justify their need for contact, rather than assuming unlimited access to my time and resources. The new number sat in my phone like a fresh start. No history, no guilt attached to the notifications, just clean open space. For 3 weeks, that new phone stayed mostly quiet. Work calls, a few texts from friends, nothing from my family because they didn't have the number. My old phone, which I kept active but silenced, began to accumulate messages. First a few, then more, then a flood. I didn't read them. I checked only to confirm they were coming evidence that my absence was finally being noticed. Silence, I learned, can be a weapon. The weapon of silence proved effective faster than I'd anticipated. 6 weeks after I'd changed my contact information, I received a call from cousin Rachel. We'd never been particularly close, but she was decent enough, one of the few family members who'd always treated me with basic kindness. "Brittany," she said when I answered, her voice tight with concern. "Your mom's been trying to reach you. She says your number's disconnected." "I changed it," I said simply. "Oh." A pause. "Is everything okay? She's pretty worried." I nearly laughed at that. Worried. What's she worried about, Rachel? Another pause, longer this time. "Well, she didn't say exactly, but she really needs to talk to you. She said it's important. If it's genuinely urgent, she can contact my attorney's office. I left those instructions with my assistant." "Your attorney?" Rachel's voice rose slightly. "Brittany, what's going on? Did something happen?" "I'm just creating some boundaries. Listen, I appreciate you calling, but I need to go." I hung up, feeling the old guilt trying to reassert itself, but I pushed it down. If my mother wanted to reach me, she had a path. The fact that she was recruiting relatives instead of using the official channel told me everything about what kind of emergency this was. Through Rachel and a few other peripheral family members who still had my contact information, I began to piece together what was happening back home. I didn't ask directly. I'd made it clear I wasn't interested in family drama, but people talked anyway, unable to resist sharing gossip disguised as concern. The crisis, it turned out, was Madeline. Apparently, collection agencies had started calling the house. Not occasionally, but constantly. Multiple calls per day from different creditors. When my mother finally sat Madeline down and demanded the truth, the scope of the problem revealed itself like a rot that had been growing in the walls. Madeline had gambling debts totaling nearly $80,000. The number staggered me when I heard it. 80,000. Accumulated over years, apparently, through online poker sites, sports betting apps, and regular trips to casinos in neighboring states. She'd maxed out credit cards, taken out personal loans borrowed from friends who'd long since cut her off. The interest had compounded. The minimum payments had become unmanageable. And now the consequences were arriving all at once like bills that could no longer be ignored. My mother, I learned, had known about the gambling for at least 2 years. She'd been covering small amounts here and there, convinced she could quietly solve the problem before it got out of hand. She'd enabled Madeline's addiction the same way she'd enabled everything else, with secrecy and unconditional support that asked nothing in return. But $80,000 was beyond her capacity. Even with my father's pension and their modest savings, they couldn't come close to covering it. They needed help. They needed someone with resources. They needed me. According to Rachel, my mother had tried calling my old number dozens of times before realizing it was disconnected. Then she'd tried emailing, only to have her messages bounce back with automated responses. She'd sent messages through Facebook that sat unread. She'd even apparently called my old workplace, only to be informed I was no longer with that company. That must have been a shock. I'd founded my own firm 3 years ago, but I'd never mentioned it to them. Why would I? They'd never asked about my work with any genuine interest. My mother had then reached out to a few colleagues whose names she remembered from years ago, people I'd mentioned in passing during long-ago phone calls. They'd been polite but firm. They couldn't help her reach me. One had apparently told her I was traveling extensively for business. Another said I was in meetings. The consistency of the stonewalling must have driven her to desperation. What struck me most forcefully hearing these second-hand accounts was what my mother wasn't asking about. She wasn't wondering if I was safe. She wasn't concerned that her daughter had apparently vanished from her previous life with no explanation. She wasn't worried about my health, my well-being, whether something terrible had happened to me. The only questions were logistical. How do we find her? How do we reach her? How do we get her to respond? The concern wasn't about me. It was about access to me. When Rachel had said my mother was worried, she'd meant worried about solving Madeline's crisis, not worried about her oldest daughter's well-being. The distinction was subtle but devastating. And then the narrative construction began. Through the grapevine, I heard the story my mother was telling. Brittany had cut them off without warning or explanation. She'd changed her number, disappeared from their lives, refused all contact. She was being cruel and vindictive over some imagined slight. She'd always been cold, but this was beyond comprehension. Here was poor Madeline struggling with a gambling problem that wasn't her fault. It was an illness after all, practically a disease, and her wealthy sister wouldn't even take their calls. The story spread through my extended family with remarkable speed. I heard variations of it from 3 different sources within a week. Each version painted me as progressively more heartless. In one telling, I'd explicitly told my mother I never wanted to hear from her again. In another, I'd laughed when asked to help Madeline. None of it was true, but truth wasn't the point. The point was to explain my absence in a way that preserved their victimhood. Madeline predictably played her part perfectly. She posted vague, wounded messages on social media about family betrayal and facing struggles alone. She never mentioned the gambling, of course, or the $80,000, or the years of financial support I'd already provided. Just cryptic sadness about being abandoned in her time of need. Watching this unfold from a distance was surreal. It was like watching a play where I'd been written in as the villain without my consent. I couldn't defend myself without looking petty. Any attempt to correct the record would require me to divulge private financial information, to air family dysfunction publicly, to engage in exactly the kind of mudslinging that would make me look as bad as them. So I stayed quiet and watched them prove beyond any doubt exactly who they were. An old friend from my hometown, someone who'd grown up knowing my family, sent me a gentle message. "I heard things are complicated with your folks. Just wanted you to know I'm here if you need to talk." The kindness of it, the lack of judgment, almost broke me. I thanked her and said I appreciated it, but was okay. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to defend myself to someone who was offering unconditional support. But her message made me realize something. The people who truly cared asked about me, not about the situation. They offered presence, not solutions. They didn't demand explanations or try to mediate or suggest I should forgive for my own good. My family, in contrast, wanted one thing: for me to resume my role as the fixer, the bank, the solution to problems I didn't create. They didn't miss me. They missed what I provided. I learned about the article before my family did. The journalist had contacted me 3 months earlier, researching a piece on boutique consulting firms that had successfully scaled and been acquired. I'd agreed to a brief interview, thinking nothing would come of it. These pieces were published all the time in industry publications that my family would never read. But this one landed in a mainstream business magazine with significant circulation. And it went online on a Tuesday morning with a headline that was more dramatic than I'd expected: "The Quiet Architect: How One Woman Built a Corporate Strategy Empire." The piece was flattering, perhaps overly so. It detailed how I'd founded Kelly Strategic Consulting 12 years ago with 2 clients and a rented desk in a co-working space. How I'd built a reputation for solving problems other consultants couldn't crack. how Fortune 500 companies had sought out my firm specifically for high-stakes corporate restructuring, and how 6 months ago, a major international consulting group had acquired my firm in a deal, the article valued at $75 million, with performance incentives that could push it over $100 million. There was a photograph of me from the day we'd signed the deal standing in front of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city wearing a charcoal suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I looked confident, successful, like someone who had built something significant. I'd mentioned none of this to my family. Not the founding of the firm, not the growth, not the acquisition. Why would I? They'd never asked about my work beyond the most superficial pleasantries, and I'd learned long ago that my achievements made them uncomfortable rather than proud. The article went live at 8 in the morning. By 10, my phone, the new one only a handful of people had started receiving texts from professional contacts congratulating me on the coverage. By noon, the article had been shared widely in business circles on social media. And by 2 in the afternoon, according to the cousin who later told me the whole story, the screenshot landed in the Kelly family group chat. I wasn't in that chat anymore. I'd muted it years ago and eventually left it entirely when I changed phones. But I could picture exactly how it unfolded. Cousin David, who worked in finance and followed business news, would have seen the article and immediately recognized my name. He would have screenshot it and sent it to the group with something like, "Wow, had no idea Brittany was doing this well." The silence that must have followed would have been deafening. My mother called Rachel within minutes. Then she called 2 other relatives whose numbers she had. I know this because all 3 of them contacted me separately over the next 2 days, their messages carrying the same confused energy. "Your mom saw an article about you. She seems upset. What's going on?" Upset. Not proud. Not excited. Upset. Through these intermediaries, I learned that my mother had read the article 3 times, going over every detail as if looking for evidence it was a mistake or exaggeration. She'd apparently asked my father if he'd known about any of this. He hadn't. She'd asked if I'd ever mentioned starting a business. Neither of them could recall it because I hadn't. I'd quietly built an empire while they were focused entirely on Madeline's latest crisis, and they'd never noticed. What struck me most hearing about her reaction secondhand was the absence of maternal pride. There was no, "I can't believe our daughter did this," or "she must have worked so hard." Instead, there was shock that bordered on betrayal, as if my success without their knowledge was itself an act of aggression. And beneath the shock, according to Rachel, who'd spoken to my mother directly, there was fear. For 35 years, my mother had controlled the family narrative. She was the matriarch who held everything together through sacrifice and wisdom. Madeline was the sensitive daughter who needed protection, and I was the competent, distant daughter who was fine on my own and therefore required minimal attention. That story had worked because everyone played their assigned roles. But this article shattered the narrative. It revealed that I hadn't just been fine. I'd been extraordinary. I'd built something remarkable while they'd been treating me as an afterthought. And more damning, it proved that when I'd walked away from them, I'd done it from a position of absolute strength, not weakness or spite. I hadn't left because I was broken or angry or incapable of maintaining relationships. I'd left because I'd finally recognized my own value and refused to accept less than I deserved. That realization must have been devastating for my mother, because it meant I was beyond her control, beyond her manipulation, beyond the guilt and obligation she'd used to manage me for decades. I didn't need them financially, emotionally, or socially. I had built an entire professional life, a network, a reputation that existed completely independent of my family. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that there was no putting it back. Madeline's reaction, I heard, was different, but equally revealing. She'd apparently gone silent in the group chat, not responding to the congratulatory messages others were posting. Then, hours later, she'd posted something on her personal social media, a vague, bitter comment about how success changes people and how some family members forget where they came from. The jealousy was transparent and ugly. For her entire life, Madeline had been the special one, the daughter who required attention and accommodation. Her struggles had been the family's primary concern, her needs the organizing principle around which everyone else had to arrange themselves. She'd been told implicitly and explicitly that she was more important than me, and now confronted with evidence of exactly how unimportant her drama was compared to real achievement, she couldn't handle it. The comparison made her look worse, not better. My success highlighted her failures in a way that couldn't be explained away by sensitivity or bad luck. Worse, she must have realized in that moment that I was never coming back to save her. The $80,000 in gambling debt, the creditors, the collection calls, those were her problems now. I had the resources to help clearly, but I had chosen not to. And that choice, made from a position of strength rather than spite, was something she couldn't manipulate or guilt me out of. The golden child's facade was cracking, and there was no one left to maintain it for her. Several relatives reached out to me over the following days, their messages walking the careful line between congratulations and confusion. They wanted to celebrate my success, but also couldn't quite reconcile it with my mother's wounded narrative about being abandoned. A few asked directly, why hadn't I told the family about the business? I gave them the simple truth. They never asked. The words sat there, impossible to argue with. They finally saw me, and it terrified them. The terror didn't last long before it transformed into strategy. 3 days after the article went viral in business circles, I received a call from Aunt Linda. She'd always been kind to me, one of the few relatives who seemed to see me as a person rather than a role. When her name appeared on my screen, I hesitated before answering. "Brittany," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but your mother asked me to reach out." Of course she did. My mother was too smart to contact me directly after months of silence. She needed an emissary, someone I wouldn't immediately dismiss, someone who could deliver her message wrapped in genuine affection. "She's really struggling," Linda continued. "She misses you terribly. She knows things have been difficult and she wants to talk to try to understand what went wrong. She's heartbroken, honey. Would you be willing to meet with her?" Just to talk. The script was so transparent I could almost see the bullet points my mother had given her. Heartbroken. Misses you. Wants to understand. All the language designed to activate my guilt, my sense of duty, my deeply ingrained belief that good daughters give their mothers chances. "I don't know, Linda," I said carefully. "I know it's hard, but she's getting older, Brittany. We all are. And family as well, family is what we have. Maybe just hear her out for your own peace, if nothing else." The aging parent card, right on schedule. I felt the old machinery of obligation grinding to life inside me. The decades of conditioning that said refusing your mother was a kind of moral failure. Against every instinct that told me this was a mistake, I agreed to meet. One conversation, neutral location, no promises. We met at a cafe halfway between my current city and my hometown, a generic chain restaurant that specialized in being inoffensive. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the back away from the lunch crowd. When my mother walked in, I barely recognized her. She'd aged, certainly it had been nearly 8 months since I'd seen her, but it was more than that. She walked slowly, almost shuffling, one hand braced against her lower back as if in pain. Her face looked drawn, her hair more gray than I remembered. She wore a simple cardigan over a dress I recognized from years ago, the kind of outfit that suggested humble means and quiet dignity. She was, I realized, with clinical detachment, performing frailty. "Brittany." She said my name like a prayer, settling into the chair across from me with visible effort. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Linda asked," I said. "I respect her." A flicker of something crossed my mother's face. Annoyance, maybe that I'd attributed the meeting to Linda rather than to her, but it disappeared quickly behind a mask of pained gratitude. "I've missed you so much," she said, her voice soft and trembling slightly. "The house feels so empty without you. I know things have been hard between us, and I wish we could talk about it. I wish I understood what happened." What happened? as if my departure were some mysterious event rather than the logical conclusion of 35 years of being overlooked and used. "I've been thinking about family a lot," she continued when I didn't immediately respond. "About how precious it is, how we don't have forever. You know, I'm not getting younger, and your father's health isn't what it used to be. I just want us to be okay again, to move past whatever caused this distance." The vagueness was strategic. By not naming any specific wrongdoing, she avoided having to acknowledge it. The distance was presented as a mysterious force that had descended on us rather than a boundary I'd deliberately constructed. "I saw that article about your business," she said, shifting tactics. "I had no idea you were doing so well. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I wish you'd told us." The pride sounded rehearsed, and the subtle reproach embedded in the last sentence, "I wish you'd told us," made it my fault for not sharing rather than theirs for never asking. I listened to it all with the patience I'd learned in countless difficult client meetings. I noted the emotional beats, the appeals to guilt, the careful avoidance of accountability. But I also noted what was absent. She didn't ask how I was really doing. She didn't inquire about my life, my work, what the acquisition meant, how I was handling the transition. She didn't ask why I'd left, or what had hurt me, or what I needed to feel safe in this family. The entire conversation was a monologue with predetermined talking points designed to lead to a single conclusion: Brittany would forgive the unspecified wrongs, return to the family, and resume her role as the fixer. "What would healing look like for you?" I asked, finally genuinely curious. She brightened slightly, misreading my question as capitulation. "Well, we could start spending time together again. Maybe you could come to Sunday dinners like you used to. And Madeline, she's going through such a hard time right now, and she really needs family support. I know you two have had your differences, but she's your sister. And with your success, I thought maybe you could help her get back on her feet. Not money necessarily, but advice or connections or—" There it was, the real agenda barely concealed. Reconciliation meant resuming my utility. Coming back meant solving Madeline's crisis. I let her finish, then smiled politely. "I'll think about what you've said." "That's all I ask," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Her grip was stronger than her shuffling walk had suggested. "Just think about it. For me. For family." I left the cafe 20 minutes later, having made no commitments, offered no promises, agreed to nothing. My mother, I knew, would interpret my willingness to meet as progress. She'd tell Linda that it went well, that Brittany was softening, that reconciliation was possible. But I'd made my assessment within the first 5 minutes. This wasn't reconciliation. It was recruitment. She wanted me back in my assigned role, not in a genuine relationship. The performance of vulnerability was designed to bypass my boundaries, to make me feel cruel for maintaining them. And beneath the performance, beneath the soft voice and pained expressions, I'd seen something else. Fear. The realization that I was beyond her control, beyond her manipulation, beyond the guilt she'd used to manage me for decades. They weren't sorry. They were scared and trying to pull me back in. When my polite, non-committal response at the cafe failed to produce the immediate capitulation my mother had expected, she shifted strategies. I should have anticipated it. When private manipulation doesn't work, you go public. You enlist an audience. You create pressure through community consensus. The campaign began subtly about a week after our meeting. I wouldn't have noticed if a former high school friend hadn't sent me a screenshot with a concerned message, "Is everything okay with your family?" The image showed my mother's Facebook post, a photograph of Madeline and me as children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, sitting on a porch swing smiling at the camera. The caption read simply, "Missing better days, praying for my family during these difficult times." The post had 43 comments, most from people I vaguely recognized. Church members, neighbors from my childhood, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The responses followed a predictable pattern of sympathy. "What's wrong, Margaret?" "Sending prayers." "Here if you need to talk." And my mother's responses were masterclasses in implication. She never named me directly. She simply replied with carefully worded fragments that painted a picture through omission. Some people forget where they came from once they find success. Family should come first, but not everyone was raised with those values. I'm trying to stay positive, but it's hard when your own child won't return your calls. Each comment was a brushstroke in a larger portrait, the abandoned mother suffering in dignified silence while her ungrateful daughter ignored her. Within days, the narrative had taken on a life of its own. Mutual acquaintances began sharing the post with their own commentary. So sad to see families torn apart. Money changes people. The story spread through my hometown community like water, finding every crack, seeping into church groups and book clubs and coffee shop conversations. Then my inbox started filling. The messages came from people I'd barely thought about in years: a former Sunday school teacher, my mother's bridge partner, a woman who'd lived 3 houses down when I was in middle school. Some were gentle, framed as concern. "Your mother seems to be struggling. I hope you two can work things out." Others were less subtle. "Whatever disagreement you're having, she's still your mother. Family is forever." The message that hit hardest came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly next-door neighbor from childhood. She'd taught me to ride a bike, had given me cookies after school, had been genuinely kind, in a way I still remembered fondly. Her message was short. "Your mother raised you better than this, Brittany. I'm disappointed." The accusation stung precisely because it came from someone whose opinion I'd once valued. She knew nothing about the decades of emotional neglect, the financial exploitation, the public humiliation. She only knew my mother's carefully curated version of events delivered with the perfect mix of sadness and restraint. And I couldn't defend myself, not without looking petty, vindictive, like exactly the kind of daughter who would abandon her aging mother over trivial grievances. Any attempt to explain would require me to divulge private family matters, to quantify years of dysfunction in social media comments, to argue my case before a jury of people who had already decided I was guilty. The trap was perfect. My silence looked like admission. My absence confirmed the narrative. And my mother's public dignity contrasted beautifully with my apparent coldness. The pressure built steadily. More messages, more posts. My mother shared a link to the article about my business acquisition with the caption, "So proud of my daughter's success. Wish we could celebrate together." The implication was clear: I had the resources to help, but was choosing not to, motivated by some cold calculation that prioritized money over family. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, watching the story spiral beyond my control. Each new message felt like a weight added to a scale I couldn't balance. The unfairness of it consumed me. I'd done nothing wrong except protect myself, and somehow I'd become the villain in a story I didn't write. After a particularly brutal message from a distant uncle calling me a disgrace to the Kelly name, I called Patricia Chen, a mentor from my early consulting days, who'd become one of my closest friends. Patricia had built her own firm, navigated family estrangement from toxic parents, and emerged with her integrity intact. "Don't engage," she said firmly after I'd explained the situation. "Not one word, not one public response." "But they're destroying my reputation," I protested. "People think I'm heartless. People who matter will ask you directly. People who don't matter are just consuming gossip. If you respond, you legitimize the conflict. You turn it into a he said, she said situation where everyone has an opinion. Your silence keeps it one-sided, and one-sided stories eventually reveal themselves as incomplete. So I just let them lie about me. You let them show who they are. Your mother is manipulating a community for sympathy to pressure you into resuming a role that was destroying you. That's the truth. People who care about truth will eventually see it. The rest, their opinions, don't actually matter to your life." Patricia's logic was sound, but following it felt like swallowing glass. Every instinct wanted to defend myself, to correct the record, to make people understand that I wasn't the person my mother was painting me as. But I stayed silent. I muted notifications from social media. I responded to direct messages from people I actually cared about with brief, dignified statements. "Thank you for your concern. This is a private family matter I'm handling as best I can." To everyone else, I said nothing. The silence was excruciating. Each day brought new evidence of how thoroughly my mother had poisoned the well. Former classmates unfriended me. Distant cousins posted vague messages about family values. Even people who should have known better seemed to accept the narrative without question. I threw myself into work taking on projects that required complete focus, traveling for client meetings that kept me away from my apartment, and the endless loop of checking whether the tide had turned. But even in hotel rooms in unfamiliar cities, I felt the weight of it. They were rewriting the story with me silent. They could make me the villain. The strategic silence Patricia had counseled gave me something valuable: time and clarity. While my mother waged her public campaign, I returned to the methodical work I'd started weeks earlier, documenting the financial history of my relationship with my family. It was tedious, detailed work that required me to dig through years of bank statements, tax records, and correspondence I'd saved without quite knowing why. I was cross-referencing a series of transfers from 4 years ago when I noticed something odd. A notation in my personal financial software referenced a conversation with my mother about the trust. I stared at the entry, trying to place the memory. The trust. My grandmother's trust. The recollection came back slowly, like something emerging from fog. I'd been 24, maybe 25, and my grandmother had mentioned in passing that she'd set up a trust fund for my education and future. "Your grandfather and I wanted to make sure you had something to build on," she'd said, her arthritic hands patting mine. "It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give you a start." She'd died 6 months later. I'd been grieving and overwhelmed with graduate school and the early years of my career. When I turned 25, I'd asked my mother about it once. She'd said the money had been used for family emergencies over the years and was gone. I'd accepted that explanation without question, trusting that my mother as trustee had made necessary decisions during difficult times. But now, looking at that notation, something gnawed at me. I pulled up my archived emails and searched for any correspondence about the trust. Nothing. I checked my saved documents from that period. Nothing. Then I remembered my grandmother's estate had been handled by a small law firm in her hometown. I'd received copies of documents at the time, but had filed them away. I went to my storage closet and pulled down a box I hadn't opened in a decade. The trust documents were near the bottom, yellowed but intact. I read through them with the careful attention I'd learned in contract negotiations. The trust had been established with $150,000 funded by my grandparents' savings. It named me as the sole beneficiary, with my mother serving as trustee until I turned 25, at which point control was supposed to transfer to me. The terms were clear. The funds were to be used for the education, health, and general welfare of Brittany Marie Kelly. At 25, I should have received full control. The trust should have been transferred to an account in my name. I pulled my laptop closer and started searching. It took 2 hours and 3 phone calls to the law firm that had handled the estate, but eventually I obtained access to the trust's financial records. What I found there made my hands shake. The trust had remained intact, accruing modest interest until 4 years ago. Then, in a single transaction dated November 2019, $120,000 had been withdrawn. The trustee's notation read, "Disbursement for beneficiaries' benefit, family medical emergency." But I'd had no medical emergency in November 2019. I'd been perfectly healthy, working 60-hour weeks to build my client base. I dug deeper, cross-referencing dates with my own records. November 2019 was when I'd covered what I'd thought was my mother's dental work, $5,000 she'd said insurance wouldn't cover. But $120,000. For what medical emergency? Then I remembered something else. November 2019 was around the time Madeline had suddenly stopped asking me for money for several months. I'd thought she'd finally gotten stable employment. I'd been relieved. I called the law firm again and requested complete transaction records. They arrived via encrypted email 2 days later. The paper trail was damning. The $120,000 had been transferred from the trust to my mother's personal account. From there, 4 days later, it had been transferred in multiple payments, to accounts that, when I researched them, belonged to collection agencies and credit counseling services. Madeline's gambling debts. The first wave, the one that had nearly destroyed her credit before I'd even known she had a gambling problem. The remaining $30,000 had been withdrawn in smaller increments over the following year, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, each marked as beneficiary expenses, but corresponding to nothing in my own financial life. Cross-referencing dates, I could match several withdrawals to periods when I'd sent my mother money for emergencies that apparently didn't exist. My grandmother had left me that money. She'd wanted me to have security opportunity, a foundation to build on. And my mother, entrusted with that gift, had stolen it, not borrowed, not used in some gray area of need. Stolen it outright, diverted it to Madeline, and lied about it for 4 years. I sat with the document spread across my dining table, feeling something cold and final settle into my chest. This wasn't emotional manipulation or passive neglect. This was theft. Criminal theft. A betrayal of fiduciary duty that carried legal consequences. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in estate litigation. She reviewed the documents for 30 minutes, then looked up at me with barely concealed anger on my behalf. "This is actionable," she said flatly. "Clear breach of fiduciary duty. You're within the statute of limitations. We could recover the full amount plus interest and legal fees. Your mother could face criminal charges." What would litigation look like? Public record, court filings, depositions. Your mother would have to explain under oath what she did with the money. It could take a year, maybe 2, but you'd win. I imagined it. My mother on the witness stand, forced to admit she'd diverted my inheritance to cover Madeline's gambling debts. The family secrets aired in legal documents accessible to anyone. The vindication, yes, but also the cost, being forever known as the daughter who sued her own mother. "Can I think about it?" I asked. The attorney nodded. "Take your time, but understand not pursuing this is a choice. You'd be allowing her to keep what she stole." I left her office and drove to a park near my apartment. I sat on a bench watching the evening light fade and thought about my grandmother. She'd been strong, principled, kind in ways my mother had never learned. She'd saved that money over decades, wanting to give me something her own daughter couldn't or wouldn't provide. And my mother had taken it, had violated that trust, that love, that carefully preserved gift, and handed it to Madeline, who'd literally gambled it away. The decision not to sue wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Litigation would consume years of my life, would keep me tethered to my family through court dates and depositions, would give my mother exactly what she wanted, my attention, my engagement, proof that I still cared enough to fight. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. But the knowledge of the theft changed something fundamental in me. Whatever guilt I'd carried about walking away, whatever doubt about whether I was being too harsh, evaporated completely. They didn't just take my money. They took my choice and my grandmother's love and gave it to the daughter who squandered everything. The discovery of the trust fund theft crystallized something in me. I'd been playing defense, absorbing attacks, maintaining dignified silence, while my mother constructed a narrative that painted me as heartless. But silence, I was beginning to understand, could be both shield and sword. The question was how to wield it strategically. During my mother's social media campaign, one recurring theme had emerged: her declining health. She'd posted vaguely about difficult doctor appointments and health challenges that come with age. In comments, she'd mentioned being unable to do things she used to enjoy, needing help with basic tasks, struggling with mobility issues that made her dependent on others, presumably Madeline, the devoted daughter who stayed. I knew my mother had chronic conditions: diabetes, high blood pressure, the beginnings of arthritis. She'd had these conditions for years, managed with medication and regular checkups. But the way she described her health now suggested someone on the verge of disability, someone who needed constant care and support. It was possible her conditions had worsened. It was also possible this was another manipulation designed to increase pressure on me to return and resume my role as financial support. I needed to know which. I contacted a private investigation firm that specialized in insurance fraud cases. The investigator I spoke with was professional and matter-of-fact. "You want surveillance documentation of her daily activities," she confirmed. Nothing invasive, just observation in public spaces to verify whether her claimed limitations match reality. Exactly. How long? 2 weeks. I want a comprehensive picture. The report arrived 15 days later as a password-protected digital file. I opened it alone in my apartment on a Saturday morning, coffee growing cold beside me as I reviewed the contents. The investigator had been thorough. Timestamps, locations, video footage, photographs. My mother's activities over 2 weeks were documented in clinical detail. Day 3. Subject observed at shopping mall walking without assistance for approximately 45 minutes. Carried multiple shopping bags. No apparent mobility issues. Day 5. Subject attended church service, arrived 30 minutes early, remained standing in fellowship hall for extended conversation. No wheelchair walker or cane observed. Day 8. Subject met 3 friends for lunch at casual restaurant. Video shows subject walking from parking lot approximately 200 feet without difficulty. Meal lasted 2 hours. The video footage was particularly damning. My mother moved normally, not with the sprightliness of a 20-year-old certainly, but without the severe limitations she'd been describing online. She carried shopping bags, climbed stairs at the church, navigated parking lots without assistance. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman in her early 60s, with manageable chronic conditions, who was living a normal, active life. The investigator's conclusion was straightforward. Subject displays no mobility limitations consistent with claimed disability. All observed activities suggest normal functionality for age and known medical conditions. I sat with the report for 2 days considering my options. I could blast this evidence across social media, directly refuting my mother's narrative with video proof. The vindication would be immediate and satisfying, but it would also make me look vindictive, like I was attacking a sick woman, and it would draw me into the public spectacle I'd been avoiding. Instead, I chose precision over spectacle. I compiled a brief summary, 2 pages, factual and unemotional, documenting my years of financial support to the family, the trust fund theft I'd discovered, and the evidence that my mother's claimed health crisis was exaggerated. I attached selected video clips and the investigator's report. Then I sent it to 3 people. The first was Aunt Linda, who'd mediated the cafe meeting. I included a note, "You asked me to hear my mother out. I did. I think you deserve to know the full picture before you're asked to mediate again." The second was Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd written that I was raised better than this. My note to her was simpler. "I understand you're disappointed in me. This is why I made the choices I did. I hope it provides context." The third was my attorney for documentation purposes. I didn't post anything publicly. I didn't send mass emails. I didn't defend myself in the court of social media opinion. I simply provided truth to people who'd been manipulated and let them draw their own conclusions. The shift came slowly, then suddenly. Linda called me 3 days later, her voice tight with controlled anger, not at me, but at my mother. "I had no idea," she said. "Brittany, I'm so sorry. I never would have pushed you to meet with her if I'd known." "You were trying to help," I said. "You didn't have all the information." "Nobody did. That was intentional, wasn't it?" "Yes." Mrs. Patterson sent a handwritten letter that arrived a week later. It was brief, but genuine, an apology for judging without knowledge, and acknowledgement that family situations were more complex than they appeared from outside. She didn't ask for details or press for reconciliation. She simply corrected her earlier judgment and wished me well. But the real change happened in the whispered conversations I wasn't part of, but heard about later. Linda had apparently shared some of what she'd learned with a few trusted friends. Those friends remembered things they'd overlooked before. How my mother had always been dramatic about health issues that mysteriously resolved once she got attention. How Madeline had been coddled since childhood. How I'd been the responsible one who never got credit. The narrative didn't flip overnight. Narratives never do. But it began to crack. People started asking questions instead of accepting my mother's version at face value. A few relatives reached out to me privately, not to apologize exactly, but to express that they understood things were complicated. I didn't gloat. I didn't demand apologies from those who'd judged me. I simply continued living my life, working, building my future, and let the evidence do what evidence does, speak for itself. My mother's social media posts became less frequent. The sympathy she'd been harvesting dried up as people quietly reconsidered what they'd been told. She never acknowledged the shift publicly, but the absence of new posts about her health struggles and difficult family situation was telling. Truth doesn't shout. It waits, and when it speaks, it cannot be ignored. The quiet shift in public perception didn't go unnoticed by my mother. I could track her awareness through the decreasing frequency of her social media posts, the absence of new sympathy-seeking messages, the reports from Linda that she seemed agitated and frustrated. She'd lost control of the narrative, and people like my mother don't relinquish control easily. They simply change tactics. The new strategy arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday afternoon. A formal letter from an estate attorney I didn't recognize, informing me that my mother was revising her will and wanted me to be aware of the proposed changes. Attached was a draft of the new will and a list of conditions. I read through it twice before the full scope of the manipulation became clear. The letter explained that my mother, in the interest of fairness and family healing, was planning to divide her estate equally between her two daughters. The estate consisted primarily of the family home, now worth approximately $400,000 in the current market, along with savings and life insurance policies that brought the total to around $500,000. An equal split would give each daughter $250,000, a generous inheritance by most standards. But the generosity came with conditions, 3 of them to be precise. First, I would need to agree to serve as Madeline's financial guardian for a period of 5 years with legal authority and responsibility for managing her finances and debts. Second, I would need to sign a legal waiver releasing any and all claims related to the trust fund that had been established by my grandmother. Third, I would need to make a public statement, the draft was helpfully included, affirming that our family difficulties had been resolved and that I was grateful for my mother's love and guidance. Only upon fulfilling all 3 conditions would I receive my inheritance. The letter concluded with a paragraph about how my mother hoped this gesture would bring our family back together and how she was extending this offer out of love and a desire for reconciliation before it was too late. I called my attorney immediately. She read through the documents while I waited on the line, and I could hear her sharp intake of breath when she reached the conditions. "This is sophisticated," she said finally. "Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. Walk me through it." Condition 1 makes you legally liable for Madeline's financial decisions for 5 years. Given her gambling addiction and history of debt, you'd essentially be tying yourself to a sinking ship. Any debts she incurs, any financial disasters she creates, you're responsible as her guardian. Condition 2 forces you to waive your right to recover the $120,000 from the trust fund theft. That's gone forever if you sign. And Condition 3 is public relations, making you affirm that your mother did nothing wrong. And if I refuse, you forfeit the inheritance entirely. The will specifies that if you decline to meet the conditions, your half goes to Madeline. Your mother can then tell everyone you rejected her generous offer because you were too proud or greedy to accept reasonable terms. What if I challenge the will? You could, but it would be public, expensive, and uncertain. Conditional bequests are legal as long as they don't violate public policy. These conditions are manipulative but not illegal. You'd spend years in litigation with no guarantee of success, and the whole time you'd look like someone fighting their own mother over money. I was quiet for a moment, thinking through the geometry of the trap. Every path led to a losing outcome. Accept the conditions and bind myself legally and financially to Madeline's dysfunction while giving up my right to justice for the trust fund theft. Decline and be painted as greedy and unforgiving. Challenge it and spend years looking litigious and money-hungry. "There's one path she didn't account for," I said slowly. "What's that?" "I don't want the money." My attorney was quiet for a beat. "Explain." "She's using the inheritance as leverage because she assumes I want it. What if I remove that assumption entirely? What if I publicly decline any claim to the estate and request that my portion be donated to charity? I could hear the smile in my attorney's voice. That's elegant. You remove the money from the equation, entirely expose the conditions as manipulative rather than generous, and demonstrate that your motivations have never been financial. She's left with no leverage and no good response. Can you draft a statement? With pleasure. The statement was released 2 days later, brief and to the point. It read, I have received notification that my mother has proposed revising her will to include conditions for my inheritance. After careful consideration, I am declining any claim to my mother's estate. I request that my portion be donated to the National Foundation for Family Estrangement and Financial Abuse, an organization supporting individuals recovering from toxic family dynamics. This decision reflects my commitment to healing and moving forward. I wish my family well. It was posted on my professional social media accounts and sent to the local newspaper that had published some of my mother's earlier sympathy-seeking content. My attorney also filed it formally with the estate attorney who'd sent the original letter, making it part of the legal record. The response was immediate and exactly what I'd hoped for. People who'd been on the fence, uncertain whether to believe my mother's narrative or the quiet evidence I'd shared, suddenly had clarity. Someone motivated by greed doesn't turn down $250,000. Someone seeking revenge doesn't donate their inheritance to charity. Someone who's been lying about their family doesn't make moves this transparent and principled. The community's perception completed its shift. My mother's conditions, which had been framed as generous reconciliation, now looked like exactly what they were: manipulation dressed up as love. The fact that she'd tried to force me to waive my rights to the stolen trust fund money was particularly damning to those who knew about it. My mother had been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. She'd expected me to either capitulate or fight, both of which would have served her narrative. She hadn't expected me to walk away entirely taking the moral high ground and leaving her holding nothing but exposed manipulation. Linda called me that evening. That was brilliant, she said quietly. She's furious, but there's nothing she can say without making herself look worse. I don't need her money, I said. I never did. That was always her miscalculation. I gave her a choice she couldn't win and walked away from money I never wanted. In the weeks following my public statement about the inheritance, I settled into something that felt remarkably like peace. I'd made my position clear, removed myself from the chess game my mother was playing, and returned my focus to my actual life: the business transition following the acquisition, new client relationships, the quiet rhythms of a life lived on my own terms. News from my family reached me, occasionally filtered through the handful of relatives who still maintained contact with me. I didn't seek it out, but I didn't block it either. The updates arrived like weather reports from a distant country, factual, impersonal, describing conditions that no longer affected me directly. 6 weeks after my statement, Linda called with information she thought I should know. Madeline's being sued, she said without preamble. 3 different creditors. It's going to court next month. I absorbed this without the emotional spike I might have felt a year ago. How much? From what I understand, close to $90,000 now with interest and fees. Your mother tried to negotiate with them, but they're past negotiation. They want judgments. And Madeline, she's back living at home, has been for a month, lost her apartment when she couldn't make rent. Her car was repossessed 2 weeks ago. 27 years old, living in her childhood bedroom, no transportation, no job, facing lawsuits that would follow her for years. The consequences I'd been shielding her from for the better part of a decade had finally arrived, and there was no one left to absorb them on her behalf. How's she handling it? I asked, more from clinical curiosity than concern. Linda hesitated. Not well. According to your mother, she's angry, depressed, blames everyone but herself, especially you. Of course she does. Your mother isn't doing much better. They're apparently fighting constantly. The house isn't big enough for 2 adults who both expected someone else to solve their problems. The image was vivid, even secondhand. My mother, who'd spent nearly 3 decades building her identity around protecting and enabling Madeline, now facing the reality that her protection had created a 27-year-old child. And Madeline, who'd spent her entire life being told she was special and deserving, now confronting a world that didn't care about her feelings or her excuses. The golden child met the real world, and the real world was unimpressed. Rachel reached out a few days later with more details. She'd apparently visited the house and found the atmosphere toxic. "Your mother keeps saying if you'd just helped, none of this would have happened," Rachel reported. "And Madeline just sits there agreeing like she's the victim of your cruelty." "What do you think?" I asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I think they created this situation over decades, and you were the only thing preventing them from facing it. Now that you're gone, they're seeing what Madeline actually is without someone constantly bailing her out. It's ugly, and they can't handle it, so they're blaming you." "That sounds about right." "Aren't you angry or sad or anything?" I considered the question seriously. What did I feel? "No," I said finally. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm not sad. I'm not even satisfied that they're struggling. I just don't feel connected to it. It's their problem to solve, and I don't have any emotional investment in how they solve it or whether they solve it at all." The detachment wasn't callousness. It was the natural result of boundaries maintained long enough that they became real. Madeline's crisis didn't live in my body anymore. Her debts didn't create anxiety in my chest. Her failures didn't generate the old familiar guilt that maybe I should do more, be more, sacrifice more. I'd spent so many years being enmeshed in their dysfunction that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be separate. Now, hearing about Madeline's collapse from a distance, I felt the way I might feel hearing about a stranger's troubles. Mild sympathy, perhaps, but no obligation, no pull to fix it, no voice telling me this was somehow my responsibility. Through the grapevine, I heard that my mother had tried to get Madeline into a debt consolidation program, but Madeline wouldn't cooperate with the required budgeting and counseling. She'd enrolled Madeline in a gambling addiction support group, but Madeline had stopped going after 2 sessions. She'd helped Madeline apply for jobs, but Madeline found fault with every opportunity. The hours were inconvenient, the pay was insulting, the work was beneath her. The pattern was achingly familiar. Madeline waiting to be rescued, rejecting every solution that required her own effort, growing increasingly resentful that the rescue wasn't materializing. My mother frustrated and exhausted, unable to solve a problem that required Madeline's participation, beginning to see cracks in the golden image she'd so carefully maintained. Their fights, according to multiple sources, were spectacular. Madeline accusing my mother of not doing enough, not caring enough, not being the mother she needed. My mother accusing Madeline of being ungrateful, irresponsible, unwilling to help herself. Both of them circling back to blaming me, the absent sister, the cruel daughter who had resources but wouldn't share them. I was their scapegoat, the external enemy that allowed them to avoid examining their own dysfunction. As long as they could blame me, they didn't have to confront the reality that they'd created this situation together through decades of enabling and entitlement. And I was fine being their villain if it meant I didn't have to be their savior anymore. The strangest part was how little I thought about them unless someone brought them up. My days were full of work. I found meaningful relationships with people who saw me clearly, hobbies I'd finally had time to cultivate. I traveled. I read. I took a pottery class and was surprisingly terrible at it. I dated someone briefly and ended it amicably when we realized we wanted different futures. I built a life that had nothing to do with managing other people's crises. And in that life, I rarely thought about Madeline or my mother at all. When I did think about them, it was with the kind of distant observation you might apply to a case study. The system that had functioned for so long required my participation. I was the shock absorber, the financial backup, the responsible one who made their irresponsibility possible. Remove that piece, and the system collapsed under its own weight. This time, no one stepped in, and the golden cage collapsed. The detachment I'd achieved felt hard-won and precious, something I protected carefully. So when a package arrived via courier on a gray Thursday afternoon, bearing the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize in my grandmother's hometown, I approached it with caution. My grandmother had been dead for over a decade. What could possibly be arriving from her estate now? The package was small, rigid, clearly containing documents. I signed for it and carried it to my kitchen table, studying the exterior before opening it. The law firm's name was embossed on the envelope, Morrison & Associates Estate Planning. A letter was clipped to the outside. "Dear Miss Kelly," it read. Enclosed. "Please find a letter from your late grandmother, Dorothy Ann Kelly, which was entrusted to our firm with specific instructions for delivery. Per the terms of her estate directive, this letter was to be given to you only if you became estranged from your mother for a period exceeding 6 months. Our firm has been monitoring this condition through periodic contact with designated family members. We understand the condition has been met. Please accept our condolences for the family difficulties that necessitated this delivery." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a cream-colored envelope, heavy stock with my name written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, slightly shaky, even then arthritis making the letters less precise than they'd once been. The envelope was sealed with old-fashioned wax, the kind my grandmother had always used for special correspondence. I sat down before opening it. Whatever was inside had been waiting for over a decade, held in trust, until the exact circumstances we were now in came to pass. My grandmother had known even before her death that this moment might come, that I might need whatever she'd left me. The letter was dated 3 months before she died. I recognized the timeline. She'd been diagnosed with cancer, had known she was dying, had put her affairs in order with the methodical care she'd brought to everything. "My dearest Brittany," it began, and I could hear her voice so clearly it hurt. "If you're reading this, it means you've done what I always hoped you'd be brave enough to do. You've chosen yourself over a family that couldn't see your worth. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, though I wish I'd been alive to support you through it. I'm writing this now because there are things I need you to know, things I couldn't say while I was alive without causing a rupture I didn't have the courage to risk. I saw how you were treated. I saw it for years and said nothing, and that cowardice is one of my deepest regrets. I watched your mother favor Madeline, watched her hold you to impossible standards while excusing your sister from any standards at all. I watched you give and give and give and receive so little in return. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that your mother was doing her best, that all families had their complexities. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I challenged her, she'd cut me off from you entirely, and I couldn't bear that. So I stayed quiet and hated myself for it. What I can tell you now, what I need you to understand, is that none of this is your fault. Your mother has carried a grief that poisoned her heart. She looks at you and sees someone she lost, and it has made her unable to see you for who you are. She sees a ghost instead of a daughter, and no amount of effort on your part could change that, because the problem was never you. It was always her inability to separate her pain from her present. I set up the trust fund because I wanted you to have something that was yours alone, something that couldn't be taken or shared or sacrificed. I wanted you to know that someone saw you valued, you believed in your dreams enough to invest in them. I hope your mother honored that trust. I hope the money went to your education, your future, your freedom. But if it didn't, if she used it for other purposes, please know that the love behind it was real. The intention was pure. You deserved that security, and I'm sorry if you didn't receive it. You have always been enough, Brittany. More than enough. You were the child who needed nothing, not because you were strong, but because you were never allowed to be weak. You were the daughter who understood because no one ever tried to understand you. You were the one who held everything together while slowly coming apart inside. I see you. I have always seen you. And I am so proud of the woman you've become despite everything that was done to you, everything that was withheld from you. If you're reading this, you've walked away. Good. Don't go back. Don't let guilt or duty or the fear of judgment pull you back into a role that was destroying you. You deserve love that doesn't come with conditions. You deserve to be seen for who you are, not who they need you to be. Live your life, my darling girl. Live it fully and freely and without apology. That's what I want for you. That's what I've always wanted for you. With all my love, Grandma Dorothy. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Someone had witnessed it all. Someone had known the truth and hadn't required me to prove it or justify it or defend it. Someone had loved me without conditions and had found a way to tell me even from beyond the grave. The reference to Sarah, someone she lost, confirmed what I'd suspected since finding that photograph. My resemblance to my dead sister had poisoned my mother's ability to love me. The grief my grandmother mentioned was the grief of Sarah's death grief that my mother had never processed, never healed from, and had instead channeled into a twisted form of resentment toward the child who looked too much like the one she'd lost. I didn't have the full story yet, but I had enough to know that my instincts had been correct. The inequality, the coldness, the impossible standards, they weren't about my failures. They were about my mother's inability to separate me from her pain. And the trust fund my grandmother mentioned with such hope, such love had been stolen and given to Madeline. My grandmother had died believing her gift would secure my future. Instead, it had been diverted to cover my sister's gambling debts. I held the letter carefully, this fragile piece of paper that carried such weight. It would go in my safe deposit box, I decided. A piece of evidence, yes, but more than that, proof that I had been loved unconditionally by someone, even if only one person. Proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't being too sensitive or too hard to please. My grandmother saw what my mother refused to and left me the truth I needed to survive. My grandmother's letter became a touchstone over the following weeks. I'd read it when doubt crept in, when the old guilt tried to reassert itself, when I questioned whether I'd been too harsh or too unforgiving. Her words reminded me that walking away wasn't cruelty, it was survival. That choosing myself wasn't selfishness, it was sanity. I kept the letter in my nightstand drawer close enough to access whenever I needed that reminder. Which is where I was rereading it by lamplight on a Tuesday night around 11 when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers at this hour were rarely good news, but something made me pick up. Brittany. The voice was slurred, thick with alcohol and tears. It took me a moment to place it. Madeline. Don't hang up, please. I know you hate me, but just don't hang up yet. I could hear noise in the background, music and voices, the ambient chaos of a bar. Where are you? Doesn't matter. Somewhere. Drinking. That's what I do now, you know, since the gambling got too expensive. She laughed, a brittle sound without humor. Mom thinks I'm at a job interview. Can you believe that at 11 at night? But she wants to believe I'm trying, so she does. I waited, saying nothing. Experience had taught me that Madeline's conversations followed their own logic and interrupting only derailed them. I hate my life, she said finally, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for years. I hate living in that house, in that room, being 27 and having nothing. No car, no job, no money, no future. Do you know what that feels like? To have completely fucked up your entire life by your 20s? Why are you calling me Madeline? Because you're the only one who doesn't lie to me. Her voice cracked. Mom keeps saying it'll be okay, that we'll figure it out, that things will turn around. But they won't. I know they won't. And you're the only one who'd tell me the truth. You were always the truthful one. I sat up straighter, setting my grandmother's letter aside. This wasn't the Madeline I knew, the one who blamed everyone else and played the victim. This was something rawer, more honest, even if the honesty was alcohol-fueled. You want the truth? I asked quietly. I want to understand why you got out and I didn't. Why you're successful and I'm a fucking disaster. We grew up in the same house, Brittany. Same parents. So why did you turn out like you and I turned out like this? The question hung in the air between us, genuine and painful. Because I had to, I said. Because I was never given the option to fail. You were. She was quiet for a long moment. I know, she whispered. I know that, and I hated you for it. Do you know that I hated that you were free, and I wasn't? Free. The word came out sharper than I intended. You think I was free? Freer than me. Mom never let me do anything. Every time I wanted to try something, she had a reason why it wouldn't work, why I shouldn't risk it, why I should stay safe. She handled everything for me, my bills, my problems, my life. I never learned to do anything myself because she never let me. I heard the truth in it even through the alcohol and emotion. My mother had handicapped Madeline as surely as she'd neglected me, just in opposite ways. I'd been forced to be competent. Madeline had been prevented from becoming competent. Both were forms of damage. You resented me for being ignored, I said slowly, and I resented you for being protected. But we were both being hurt, just differently. Yeah. She laughed again, that same broken sound. The golden child. That's what they called me, right? Like that was supposed to be a good thing. But being the favorite of a fucked up family just means you're the one they fuck up the most. The insight surprised me. I'd never heard Madeline acknowledge the dysfunction so clearly. I couldn't leave, she continued. I tried once, you know. When I was 24. Got an apartment, a roommate was going to start over. Mom cried for 3 days, said I was abandoning her, that she needed me, that she couldn't handle being alone. So I came back, and I've been stuck ever since. You came back because she cried, I said. That was a choice, Madeline. I was 24, I didn't know how to... She stopped. You're right. It was a choice. A stupid, weak choice. But I made it. We sat in silence, the connection between us, fragile and strange. For the first time in our lives, we were talking to each other honestly, without the scripts our mother had written for us. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. For all of it. For taking the money from your trust fund. I didn't know it was yours not until later, and by then it was gone. For the gambling, for the debts, for expecting you to fix everything. For hating you when you stopped fixing things. The apology landed somewhere between genuine and convenient. I didn't entirely trust it, but I didn't entirely dismiss it either. What do you want from me, Madeline? Nothing. I don't want anything. I needed to tell you that I get it now. Why you left. You were saving yourself. I should have saved myself too, but I didn't, and now I don't know how. Therapy, I said. Real therapy. Not the gambling support group Mom enrolled you in. A therapist who specializes in family dysfunction and addiction. That's how you start. Can't afford it. There are sliding scale clinics, community mental health centers. If you actually want help, there are options. If I actually want it, she repeated. You don't think I do? I think you want your life to be different. I don't know if you want it badly enough to do the hard work of making it different. Only you know that. Another long silence. In the background, last call was being announced. I should go, she said. Thanks for not hanging up. Madeline. No, don't. Don't tell me I can do this or that you believe in me or any of that shit. We're not those sisters. We never were. I was going to say, I hope you find a way out. Genuinely. Not for me, not for Mom. For you. She made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. We were both raised in the same house, Brittany, but only one of us chose to leave. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat holding the phone for a long time after feeling something complicated and sad. Madeline was a victim of our mother's dysfunction, yes, but she was also an adult who'd made choices that led her here. I could feel compassion for her situation without taking responsibility for fixing it. I could understand how the golden cage had damaged her without reopening mine to let her in. We were both raised in the same house, but only one of us chose to leave. Madeline's call stayed with me for days afterward, not because it changed anything fundamental, but because it clarified something I'd always suspected: we'd both been damaged by the same system, just in different ways. Neither of us had escaped unscathed. I'd just chosen escape while she'd chosen captivity. 3 weeks later, Linda called with different news. It's your father, she said, her voice gentle. He's in hospice. End-stage heart failure. The doctors are saying days, maybe a week at most. I hadn't spoken to my father in over a year, hadn't seen him in longer than that. He'd been a peripheral figure in the family drama present, but passive, a man who'd chosen peace over protection. I felt no particular warmth toward him, but I also didn't feel the active resentment I held for my mother. He was simply there, a ghost in his own life. Does he want to see me? I asked. He asked for you specifically. Said there are things he needs to tell you before it's too late. I drove to the hospice facility the next day, a clean, quiet building that smelled of antiseptic and the particular stillness that surrounds the dying. My father was in a private room at the end of a long hallway. I stood outside his door for a full minute before knocking. Come in. His voice called, weaker than I remembered, but still recognizably his. He looked smaller than he had in life, diminished by illness and age, and the weight of whatever he'd carried all these years. His face brightened slightly when he saw me, then creased with something that looked like relief mixed with sorrow. Brittany, you came. Linda said you wanted to talk. Close the door, please. Sit down. I did both, taking the chair beside his bed. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, years of distance between us, making conversation feel impossible. I'm dying, he said finally, unnecessarily. And I can't die without telling you the truth. Your mother, she'll never tell you. She can't. But you deserve to know why things were the way they were. Sarah, I said quietly. His eyes widened slightly. You know, I found a photograph. Grandmother left me a letter that hinted at it. But I don't know the whole story. He nodded slowly, gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. Sarah drowned in our pool when she was 3 years old. Your mother had put her down for a nap, thought she was sleeping. The phone rang, a friend from church, something trivial that your mother can't even remember now. They talked for maybe 20 minutes. Sarah woke up, came downstairs, went out the back door that your mother thought was locked but wasn't. By the time your mother found her, she'd been in the water too long. The paramedics tried, but... He stopped, his breath catching. Even after 37 years, the memory clearly caused him pain. It was ruled accidental. No charges, no investigation beyond the standard procedures. The community rallied around us. Everyone said it could have happened to anyone, that it wasn't your mother's fault. But your mother, she never believed that. She knew she'd been distracted. She blamed herself completely. And then I was born, I said, understanding beginning to crystallize. 2 years later. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but when your mother found out, she saw it as a gift, a second chance. She convinced herself it was fate's way of giving her another daughter, of healing the wound Sarah's death had left. She had such hopes for you. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing the past. But when you were born, when you started to grow, you looked exactly like Sarah. The same eyes, the same expressions, even the same mannerisms. It was uncanny. And instead of bringing your mother comfort, it brought her agony. Every milestone you reached, she thought of Sarah never reaching it. Every time she looked at you, she saw the daughter who died because of her inattention. The words landed like physical blows, each one confirming what I'd suspected, but never wanted to believe. She tried, my father continued, his voice breaking. She really did try to love you the way she'd loved Sarah. But she couldn't separate you from her guilt. You became a daily reminder of her greatest failure, and rather than getting help, rather than addressing her grief and trauma, she just pulled back, became cold, set impossible standards that maybe unconsciously she hoped you'd fail to meet, so she wouldn't have to feel so inadequate by comparison. And then Madeline was born, 8 years later. And Madeline looked like me. Different coloring, different features, no ghosts attached. Your mother could love Madeline freely because Madeline wasn't a reminder of anything except the present. The favoritism wasn't intentional exactly. It was just easier. Easier to love the child who didn't make her feel guilty, I said flatly. Yes. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back. "I'm sorry, Brittany. I'm so sorry. I saw what was happening. I knew it was wrong. But I didn't know how to stop it. Your mother was so fragile after Sarah's death. I was afraid if I pushed her, if I confronted her, she'd completely fall apart. So I told myself you were strong, that you'd be okay, that I was protecting the family by not causing more pain." "You protected her," I said. "Not me, not the family. Her." "Yes." The admission was barely a whisper. "I chose my marriage over my daughter's well-being. I've lived with that guilt every day, and now I'm dying with it." I looked at him, this man who'd watched me be emotionally starved for 35 years and done nothing. Part of me wanted to rage at him to make him feel the full weight of his complicity in those final days. But mostly, I just felt tired. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "It helps to understand. It doesn't fix anything, but it helps. Can you forgive me?" I considered lying, giving him the peace he wanted. But I'd spent too many years telling comfortable lies. "No," I said. "But I understand why you made the choices you did. That's the best I can offer." He nodded, tears sliding down his weathered face. "That's more than I deserve." I stayed for another 20 minutes sitting in silence while he drifted in and out of sleep. Before I left, he opened his eyes one more time. "Your mother will never admit this to you. She can't. But I needed you to know none of this was your fault. You were innocent. You've always been innocent." I walked out of that hospice room with something I'd never had before: complete clarity. My mother's rejection wasn't about my worthiness, or my failures, or my inability to be enough. It was about her unprocessed trauma, her guilt, her inability to separate a living daughter from a dead one. I finally understood why she never loved me. I was the ghost she couldn't bury. My father died 3 days after our conversation. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent flowers with a simple card, "Peace to you," and stayed away. The funeral was for the living, and I had no interest in performing grief for a family that had never performed love for me. But the knowledge he'd given me, the final piece of the puzzle, demanded one more conversation. Not for reconciliation, not for apology, for closure. I waited 2 weeks after the funeral, giving my mother time to settle back into whatever routine she'd build without my father. Then I called her directly, using the old number I still had memorized, despite never using it. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" Her voice was tentative, uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe I was calling. "It's Brittany. I'd like to meet with you. One final conversation. You pick the place." Silence stretched between us. "Why?" "Because Dad told me about Sarah before he died, and we need to talk about it." I heard her sharp intake of breath, the pause that confirmed everything. "I don't know if..." "This isn't a request for permission. I'm offering you the courtesy of choosing where we meet. If you decline, I'll say what I need to say in a letter that will become part of the public record through my attorney. Your choice." Another long pause. "The park near the old house. Tomorrow at 2. "I'll be there." The park was neutral ground, a place from my childhood that held no particular emotional weight. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat on a bench facing the playground, watching young mothers push their children on swings, their watchful attention ensuring safety, preventing tragedy. My mother approached exactly at 2, walking slowly, dressed in black as if still in mourning. She looked older than she had at the cafe months ago, the weight of my father's death and her exposed manipulations evident in the lines of her face. She sat on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining physical distance. "You look well," she said, an automatic pleasantry that fell flat. "I am well," I replied. "Better than I've been in years, actually." She flinched slightly at that. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before I began. "Dad told me everything before he died. About Sarah. About how she died. About how I looked like her and you couldn't separate us. About how that's why you could never love me the way you loved Madeline." My mother's hands clenched in her lap, her face going pale. He had no right. He had every right. I had a right to know why I spent 35 years trying to earn love from someone who couldn't give it because of a tragedy I had nothing to do with. It's not that simple. Actually, it is. Sarah drowned because you were distracted. That's not blame, that's fact. It was an accident, a terrible accident, and I'm genuinely sorry that happened to you. No parent should lose a child that way. No parent should carry that guilt. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. But you did carry it. And instead of getting help, instead of processing your grief and trauma in healthy ways, you transferred that guilt onto me. I became your daily reminder of failure, of loss, of everything you couldn't face about yourself. And you punished me for it. For 35 years. I didn't punish you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, you did. Maybe not consciously. Maybe you told yourself you were being fair, being reasonable. But you held me to impossible standards while excusing Madeline from any standards at all. You took my grandmother's trust fund money she saved for my future and gave it to Madeline to cover gambling debts. You publicly humiliated me at family gatherings. You weaponized my competence and turned my success into evidence of moral failure. You stole from me emotionally and financially for decades. My mother's facade began to crack. Her hands trembled. When she spoke, her voice shook. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. Do you understand that? Every time. Your face, your expressions, the way you tilted your head, it was like Sarah was haunting me. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the guilt of knowing she would never grow up, never have the chances you had because I looked away for 20 minutes. I understand that was painful for you. I do. But Mom, I was a child, your child, and I deserved better than being treated like a ghost. I know. The words came out broken. I know you did. I tried. In the beginning, when you were a baby, I tried so hard to separate you from her in my mind. But as you got older, as the resemblance became impossible to ignore, I couldn't. Every achievement felt like a betrayal of Sarah. Every birthday was a reminder of birthdays she'd never have. I started pulling back because it hurt less to not feel anything than to feel it all. So you chose numbness with me and love with Madeline. Madeline didn't remind me of death. She reminded me of life, of moving forward. It wasn't fair to you. I know that. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to love you without drowning in grief every time I looked at you. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest, in a way she'd never been before. Did you ever consider therapy? I asked. Did you ever think that maybe the problem wasn't me but your unprocessed trauma? Your father suggested it once. I refused. I thought I could handle it on my own. I thought time would heal it. She laughed bitterly. But it didn't. It just calcified. And by the time I realized how damaged our relationship had become, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to bridge the gap I'd created. So you didn't try. You just kept favoring Madeline and treating me like an obligation. Yes. The word was simple, final. And now look what I've done. I've lost you completely. Madeline is a disaster I helped create by protecting her from everything. Your father is dead. And I'm alone with the consequences of 35 years of cowardice. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of sad understanding. My mother was a broken person who'd broken her daughter because she couldn't face her own pain. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it in a way that released me from the question I'd carried my whole life. What's wrong with me that she can't love me? Nothing was wrong with me. It had never been about me. I forgive you for the grief, I said carefully. For the pain of losing Sarah, for the trauma of that experience. That wasn't something you chose, but I don't forgive the choices you made afterward. You chose not to get help. You chose to take your pain out on me. You chose to steal my trust fund. You chose to publicly manipulate me and then paint me as the villain when I set boundaries. Grief is involuntary. Cruelty is a choice. And you made that choice repeatedly for decades. My mother's face crumpled, tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The apology came too late and meant too little. It wasn't followed by any promise to change any request for how to make amends. It was just words empty and insufficient. Can you ever forgive me? She asked. Is there any way to fix this? I stood up, gathering my bag. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you. And I don't think there's anything to fix because I don't think you can change who you are at this point. You'll always see Sarah when you look at me, and I can't spend my life trying to be someone different just to make you comfortable. So this is it. You're just leaving. I left a year ago, Mom. This is just the conversation that makes it official. Will I ever see you again? The question was plaintive, desperate. I considered it honestly. I don't know. Right now I don't think so. But I'm not making a permanent declaration. I'm just saying I'm done waiting for you to see me. I'm done hoping you'll wake up one day and realize what you lost. I'm done organizing my life around the absence of your love. I walked toward my car, my steps steady and sure. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name one more time, but I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say. The conversation was complete. The circle closed, the truth spoken and acknowledged. I got in my car and drove away, watching her diminishing figure in my rearview mirror, until I turned the corner and she disappeared from view. I didn't come for forgiveness. I came to stop hoping for it. The drive home from the park felt longer than it was. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my hands steady even as my mind raced through everything that had been said, and more importantly, everything that hadn't. My mother had acknowledged the truth, yes, but acknowledgement without change was just another form of emptiness. She couldn't love me the way I deserved. She'd said so herself, and I couldn't spend the rest of my life waiting for her to become someone she wasn't capable of being. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and began writing down exactly what I needed to happen next. Not in anger, not in haste, but with the methodical clarity I brought to complex business problems. I was solving for peace, and the solution required clean boundaries that couldn't be negotiated or manipulated. I called my attorney the following morning. I need you to draft a formal letter establishing no contact, I told her. To my mother and sister. I want it clear, respectful, and legally documented. No contact, she repeated, meaning no phone calls, no emails, no messages through third parties, no showing up at my home or workplace. If there's a genuine emergency, and I mean life-threatening, not Madeline's latest crisis, they can contact your office and you'll determine if it warrants reaching me. This is a significant step. I know, but it's necessary. I need language that's firm but not cruel. I'm not trying to hurt them. I'm trying to protect myself. She understood. The letter was drafted, reviewed, and sent via certified mail within 48 hours. It was one page typed on my attorney's letterhead, and it said everything it needed to say without excess emotion or explanation. The letter informed my mother and Madeline that I was implementing a no-contact boundary effective immediately. It explained that this decision was made for my well-being and was not open to negotiation. It specified that any attempts to contact me directly would not receive a response, and that true emergencies could be communicated through my attorney's office, which would use discretion in determining what constituted an actual emergency. It closed with a statement that this was not a permanent declaration of estrangement, but rather an indefinite boundary that I would reassess on my own timeline, if ever. It was professional, clear, and final. When I received confirmation that both letters had been signed for, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief wash over me. The boundary was set, the door was closed. There was no going back from this without significant effort on both sides, and I knew my mother well enough to know she wouldn't make that effort. The days that followed were harder than I'd anticipated. The guilt arrived in waves, usually at unexpected moments. I'd be making coffee and suddenly think, what kind of person cuts off their mother? I'd see a greeting card display at the store and feel a pang of shame that I wouldn't be sending anything for upcoming holidays. I'd hear a song about family and wonder if I was making a catastrophic mistake. The internalized voices were loud and persistent. You only get one mother. Family is supposed to forgive. What if she dies, and you never spoke to her again? What if you regret this? These weren't just my thoughts. They were the accumulated weight of a culture that treats family loyalty as sacred regardless of the cost to individual well-being. I'd grown up in a world where cutting off family was associated with being damaged, selfish, ungrateful. Good people endured. Good daughters persevered. Good women sacrificed their own needs for family harmony. Walking away was seen as a failure of character, a moral deficiency proof that you valued your own comfort over love and duty. But I'd also spent 35 years being someone's ghost, someone's scapegoat, someone's bank account. I'd spent 3.5 decades trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it, sacrificing my own needs for a family that never once asked what I needed in return. The pattern was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. And continuing to subject myself to it wouldn't make me noble. It would make me complicit in my own destruction. Still, the guilt was exhausting. I found myself checking my phone obsessively in the first weeks, half expecting my mother to violate the boundary, half disappointed when she didn't. Some twisted part of me wanted her to fight for me, to refuse to accept the no contact, to prove that I mattered enough to pursue. But my attorney's office reported no contact attempts. The silence from my family was absolute, which told me everything I needed to know. When I'd been available and useful, they'd had no problem reaching me. Now that I'd set a boundary, they respected it not out of love for me, but out of resignation. They didn't fight because they'd already accepted the loss. Or perhaps they'd never truly had me to lose in the first place. 3 weeks after the letters were sent, I had a session with my therapist where everything came pouring out. The guilt. The shame. The fear that I was making a terrible mistake. The societal pressure I felt from people who didn't know the full story but had opinions anyway. "You're grieving," she said gently. "But I want you to identify what you're actually grieving." I thought about that. I'm not grieving my mother as she is. I'm grieving the mother I needed her to be and never was. Go on. I'm grieving the childhood I deserved, where I was seen and valued and loved unconditionally. I'm grieving the sister relationship Madeline and I could have had if we hadn't been pitted against each other. I'm grieving the fantasy of reconciliation I'd been holding on to, the idea that one day they'd wake up and realize what they'd lost and everything would be okay. And what are you accepting? That none of those things will ever happen. My mother will always see Sarah when she looks at me. Madeline will always be trapped in dysfunction until she chooses otherwise. There will be no tearful reunion, no mutual understanding, no happy ending where everyone heals and we become the family we never were. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. No contact didn't mean temporary separation. It meant accepting that the relationship I'd wanted with my family was never going to exist. It meant letting go of hope, which was somehow harder than letting go of them. But it also meant something else. It meant I could stop performing, stop trying, stop hoping, stop waiting for the phone call that would never come, the apology that would never be sincere, the love that had never been available. I could close that chapter and start writing a new one where I wasn't defined by their inability to see me. The grief came in waves over the following months. Holidays were hard. My birthday was hard. Mother's Day, ironically, was one of the hardest days, not because I missed my mother, but because I was surrounded by images of mothers and daughters who had relationships I'd never experienced. The grief wasn't for what I'd lost. It was for what I'd never had. I let myself feel it all. The sadness, the anger, the relief, the guilt, the freedom. All of it existed simultaneously, contradictory emotions that didn't cancel each other out, but simply coexisted in the complicated space where my family used to be. My therapist reminded me repeatedly that choosing no contact wasn't cruel or selfish. It was self-preservation. You're not responsible for managing their emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their choices, she said. You're responsible for your own well-being. That's not selfish. That's survival. I started reframing the decision in my mind. Not as abandonment, but as boundary setting. Not as revenge, but as self-protection. Not as failure, but as finally choosing myself after 35 years of choosing everyone else. Some people in my life understood immediately. My closest friends who'd watched me struggle for years supported the decision without question. Patricia sent me a card that simply said, "Proud of you." Linda called to say she understood and didn't blame me. A few colleagues who knew pieces of the story offered quiet validation. Others didn't understand and probably never would. Distant relatives stopped speaking to me. A few acquaintances made it clear they thought I was being unnecessarily harsh. Someone I barely knew left a comment on social media about how family is forever in what was clearly a passive-aggressive reference to my situation. I had to accept that some people would judge me without knowing the full story, and that was okay. Their opinions didn't determine my worth or the validity of my choice. I couldn't control what others thought, and I was learning not to try. What I could control was my own life, my own peace, my own boundaries. And for the first time in my life, I was choosing those things over the approval of people who didn't know or care about my actual well-being. Walking away wasn't revenge. It was the only honest choice I had left. 6 months passed more quickly than I expected. Time, I discovered, moved differently when it wasn't punctuated by crises and guilt-laden phone calls. The weeks flowed into months with a steadiness I'd never experienced before, each day predictable in the best possible way. The freedom arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. I'd wake up in the morning and reach for my phone out of old habit, that reflexive checking for messages that might require immediate action. But there were no urgent texts about Madeline's latest disaster, no voicemails from my mother disguised as casual check-ins, but actually fishing for money or support. My phone was just a phone again, not a leash connecting me to an endless cycle of need. The absence of obligation created space I didn't know I'd been missing. I started painting again, something I'd loved in college but abandoned when work and family drama consumed all my time. I bought watercolors and thick paper and spent Sunday mornings at my kitchen table creating mediocre landscapes that no one would ever see but brought me quiet satisfaction. I joined a hiking group and spent Saturdays climbing trails with people who knew nothing about my family history and didn't need to. I read novels for pleasure, entire books consumed in single sittings because there was no crisis interrupting. Holidays transformed from sources of dread into opportunities for peace. Thanksgiving arrived, and I spent it with 3 friends, none of us with family nearby, cooking an elaborate meal together and laughing at our collective lack of culinary expertise. Christmas found me volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving meals to people who thanked me with genuine gratitude rather than entitled expectation. New Year's Eve was quiet and solo, just me and a bottle of good wine, and the kind of reflective solitude I'd never been allowed when every holiday meant performing family harmony. I slept through the night. That was perhaps the most telling change. For years I'd woken at 3 or 4 in the morning, anxiety knotting my stomach as my brain ran through worst-case scenarios and potential family emergencies I might need to solve. Now I slept soundly, dreamlessly, waking refreshed rather than exhausted. The constant low-level stress I'd carried for decades had lifted, and I could feel its absence in my body. Looser shoulders, unclenched jaw, a lightness in my chest where tension used to live. But freedom wasn't simple or uncomplicated. The grief arrived without warning, triggered by the smallest things. I was having coffee at a cafe when I saw them, a mother and daughter, probably in their 60s and 30s, heads bent together over a laptop, laughing at something on the screen. The easy intimacy between them, the way the mother touched her daughter's shoulder with casual affection, the way they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. It hit me like a physical blow. I had to leave my coffee half-finished and walk quickly to my car before the tears came. A colleague got engaged, and the wedding invitation arrived with the typical RSVP card asking for my parents' names for the seating chart. I stared at that blank line for 10 minutes, feeling the weight of what I'd lost and what I'd never had colliding in a single moment. I wrote N.A. and sealed the envelope quickly before I could change my mind. A song came on the radio, something my grandmother used to hum while cooking. And suddenly, I was 7 years old again, standing in her kitchen, the only place I ever felt unconditionally loved. The memory was so vivid, and the loss so sharp, that I had to pull over until I could breathe normally again. My therapist reminded me that grief and relief could coexist, that leaving a toxic relationship didn't mean I wouldn't mourn what might have been. "You're not grieving the family you left," she said. "You're grieving the family you deserved and never had. That's a legitimate loss." The grief came in waves, unpredictable and occasionally overwhelming, but it also became more manageable over time. I learned to let it wash over me without drowning in it, to acknowledge the sadness without letting it convince me I'd made the wrong choice. Some days were harder than others. Some days I wondered if I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to burn bridges. But then I'd remember the decades of neglect, the stolen trust fund, the public humiliation, and I'd know I'd made the only choice I could. In the space my family had occupied, I began building something different. Not a replacement exactly, but a redefinition of what family could mean. Patricia became more than a mentor. She became the person I called when I needed advice, who celebrated my wins and supported me through losses without keeping score. My friend Sarah from college became someone I talked to weekly, real conversations where we were both vulnerable and both supportive in equal measure. 3 colleagues became genuine friends, people I grabbed dinner with not because we needed something from each other but because we enjoyed each other's company. I called it my chosen family, though that phrase felt both accurate and insufficient. These were relationships built on reciprocity, on mutual respect, on actually seeing each other. When Patricia asked how I was doing, she waited for a real answer. When I supported Sarah through her mother's illness, she thanked me and then found ways to support me back. These people didn't love me because they were obligated to. They loved me because they chose to, and I loved them the same way. I learned what healthy love looked like. It didn't demand endless sacrifice. It didn't punish me for having boundaries. It didn't require me to shrink or hide or pretend. It was reciprocal, honest, and freely given. The contrast with my family relationships was so stark it was almost laughable. Why had I accepted so little for so long when this kind of connection was possible? The answer I knew was that I hadn't known better. I'd thought the conditional transactional love my family offered was all there was. I'd thought all relationships required one person to give endlessly while the other person took. I'd normalized dysfunction because it was all I'd ever known. But now I knew differently. And that knowledge, bittersweet as it was, felt like freedom. Peace wasn't the absence of family. It was the presence of people who actually saw me. The peace I'd found in my chosen family and new routines felt private, sacred even. I wasn't sharing my story widely. I'd been selective in who knew the details: my closest friends, my therapist, a handful of trusted colleagues who'd noticed my transformation and asked gentle questions. I had no interest in public confession or social media vulnerability. My healing was mine. But stories have a way of traveling even when you're not the one telling them. It started small. A woman I'd worked with on a consulting project years ago reached out via LinkedIn with a message that began, "I heard through a mutual friend that you've been navigating family estrangement." She went on to share her own story, decades of being the responsible daughter, a mother who played favorites, the guilt of finally setting boundaries in her 60s. "I've felt so alone in this," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me I'm not." I responded carefully, offering support without oversharing. But her message was followed by another, then another. Women I barely knew or had met briefly at conferences or had worked with in passing started reaching out privately. The stories were eerily similar: the golden child and the scapegoat, the financial exploitation, the conditional love, the crushing guilt of choosing themselves. Many were women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s. One woman in her late 60s wrote, "I spent 40 years trying to earn my mother's approval. She died 2 years ago, and I'm still trying. Your story helped me see I can stop now." Another, a successful attorney in her mid-50s, confessed she'd been sending her younger brother money for 20 years while he lived rent-free in their mother's house, and she was treated like an afterthought. I realized I wasn't alone, not even close. The phenomenon I'd experienced, the capable child being neglected while the struggling child was endlessly supported, was so common it might as well have been a pattern in the DSM. And the women experiencing it had been suffering in silence, believing they were uniquely flawed or uniquely ungrateful. The ripple effect became more visible when a journalist named Elena Martinez contacted me. She'd read about my firm's acquisition in the business press and had heard through professional channels that I'd navigated a difficult family estrangement. She was working on a long-form piece about financial abuse within families and adult children setting boundaries with toxic parents. "I'm not interested in exposing anyone," she said during our first call. "I want to explore the phenomenon, why capable daughters are so often exploited, why setting boundaries feels like betrayal, why our culture makes it almost impossible for women to choose themselves over family dysfunction." I was hesitant. Going public, even with anonymizing details, felt risky. But Elena was thoughtful and professional, and I'd read her previous work, nuanced explorations of complex topics that treated subjects with dignity. More importantly, I kept thinking about all those women who'd reached out to me in private, carrying shame they didn't deserve. "If I do this," I said, "I want it clear that I'm not seeking sympathy or positioning myself as a victim. I made a choice for my well-being, and I'm at peace with it." "That's exactly the angle," she said. "Agency, not victimhood. Boundaries, not revenge." We spent hours on interviews. Elena asked probing questions, challenged my assumptions, and made me articulate things I'd only felt intuitively. She changed identifying details, my profession, my location, my mother's specific manipulations, but kept the emotional truth intact. The piece was titled, "The Cost of Being Capable When Family Love Comes with a Price." It was published in a major online outlet on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had thousands of shares. By Wednesday, it was trending. By Thursday, the comment section had over 800 responses. The reaction was overwhelming. Women, mostly women, though some men too, shared stories that echoed mine with eerie precision. "This is my life. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for putting words to what I've felt for 40 years. Some wrote long, detailed accounts of their own family dynamics. Others just said, "I needed to read this today." The validation was profound. I'd spent so long wondering if I was being too sensitive, too harsh, too unforgiving. But here were hundreds of people saying, "No, you were right. This is real. This happens. You're not crazy." But the pushback came too swift and harsh. Some commenters, particularly older readers, were scathing. "This woman is selfish and ungrateful. Family is family, you don't just cut people off. She'll regret this when her mother dies and it's too late." One woman wrote a paragraph about how her own daughter had cut her off for no reason and how painful it was clearly seeing herself in my mother without recognizing why that might be. A few people accused me of airing dirty laundry for attention, of exploiting my family's struggles for professional gain, of being vindictive. One comment suggested I was damaged and needed to work on forgiveness instead of playing the victim. The criticism stung more than I'd expected. Even knowing intellectually that these people didn't have the full story, didn't understand the nuance, didn't know what they were talking about, it still hurt to be called selfish and ungrateful and damaged. I called Patricia shaken. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I shouldn't have gone public. "Read me the comments that are bothering you," she said. I read them aloud, my voice tight. "Now, read me some of the positive ones." I scrolled to comments that had moved me. A woman who'd finally left an abusive mother after reading the article. A therapist who said she'd share it with clients who were struggling with similar decisions. A 68-year-old who wrote, "I've carried guilt about estranging from my family for 20 years. This article helped me breathe for the first time." "Which comments are from people who actually understand what you experienced?" Patricia asked. "The positive ones." "And which are from people who are probably uncomfortable because your story is threatening their own narratives about family obligation. The negative ones." "Exactly. You can't control how people react, especially people who are invested in believing that family loyalty trumps everything, including abuse. But look at how many people you've helped. Look at how many women finally feel seen. She was right. The negative comments came mostly from people defending a worldview where cutting off family was always wrong, where forgiveness was mandatory regardless of circumstance, where adult children owed their parents unwavering loyalty no matter what. These were people who either hadn't experienced what I experienced, or who had experienced it and couldn't face the possibility that leaving might have been an option. I couldn't let their discomfort dictate my choices or my story. Over the following weeks, I received dozens of private messages through the journalist, women thanking me for speaking up, women asking for advice, women simply saying, "Me too." Some were ready to set boundaries. Others weren't, but appreciated knowing it was possible. A few were therapists asking permission to share the article with clients. The most meaningful message came from a woman in her 70s. "I stayed," she wrote. "I spent my whole life trying to be enough for a mother who couldn't love me properly. She died 5 years ago and I still feel the weight of that failure. I'm glad you chose differently. I'm glad you didn't waste your whole life the way I did. Your story gave me permission to stop blaming myself for never being what she needed. Thank you for that gift." I read that message 3 times, tears blurring the words. If nothing else good came from the article, that one woman's liberation from decades of self-blame was enough. I didn't tell my story for applause. I told it so others wouldn't feel alone in the silence. The article's viral success brought something I hadn't anticipated: opportunities. Not the kind I'd worked for professionally, but opportunities to leverage my pain for profit and platform. They arrived with flattering regularity: emails from literary agents, speaking bureau representatives, podcast hosts, and finally, inevitably, television producers. The most aggressive pitch came from a production company that specialized in what they called reconciliation programming. The producer, a woman named Stephanie, who spoke in the enthusiastic, slightly manic cadence of someone who trafficked in human drama for a living, called me directly, somehow bypassing my attorney's screening. "Brittany, I read your story and I was moved to tears," she began, her voice dripping with practiced empathy. "Absolutely moved. And I immediately thought, this is a story that needs to be told to a wider audience. Millions of people are struggling with family estrangement, and you could help them." I listened without interrupting, curious about where this was going. "We produce a show called Family Reconnect for a major cable network. It's beautiful, really beautiful work. We bring estranged family members together, facilitate difficult conversations with the help of a licensed therapist, and help families heal. The success rate is incredible. Over 70% of our families report improved relationships 6 months after filming." "What are you proposing specifically?" I asked, though I already knew. "We'd love to do an episode with you, your mother and your sister. We'd cover all travel expenses, put you up in a beautiful hotel. And of course there's compensation. $50,000 for participation, split however you'd like. The taping is just 2 days, very controlled environment. And Dr. Morrison, he's a renowned family therapist. You may have seen him on morning shows. He'd facilitate the conversation. It's a chance for real closure, real healing, and you'd be helping countless viewers who are going through similar situations." The pitch was smooth, professional, designed to appeal to both my wallet and my desire to help others. $50,000 wasn't insignificant. The platform could indeed reach people who needed to hear that they weren't alone. But I'd seen these shows. I knew exactly what they were. "I appreciate the offer, Stephanie, but I'm going to decline." There was a beat of surprised silence. "Can I ask why? I think if you understood the format better?" "I understand the format perfectly. You create a high-stakes emotional environment, put estranged family members in a room together, and film whatever happens. Whether that's productive conversation or explosive confrontation doesn't really matter from a production standpoint either way. It's compelling television. My family's dysfunction isn't entertainment, and I'm not interested in performing my trauma for ratings." "That's not fair," Stephanie said, her tone shifting to defensive. "We genuinely help families. The therapy is real. The outcomes are documented. I'm sure some families benefit, but my situation isn't appropriate for that format, and more importantly, I don't need it. I've already done the work of confronting my mother. I don't need to do it again on camera with commercial breaks. The compensation isn't relevant. I'm not for sale, and neither is my story. Thank you for thinking of me, but the answer is no. I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, pure, uncomplicated satisfaction at setting a boundary. For decades, I'd said yes to things I didn't want to do because I feared the consequences of refusal. I'd said yes to covering Madeline's debts because I feared being called selfish. I'd said yes to family gatherings that humiliated me because I feared being called distant. I'd said yes to my mother's manipulations because I feared being called ungrateful. But saying no to this producer, this exploitative offer wrapped in therapeutic language, felt like power. Clean, clear, undeniable power. I didn't owe anyone access to my pain. I didn't need to justify my boundaries by performing them for an audience. My healing wasn't a commodity to be packaged and sold, and my worth wasn't determined by whether millions of people witnessed my story or just the handful who needed to hear it. The television offer was just the first. Over the following weeks, other opportunities arrived with varying degrees of legitimacy. A literary agent wanted to represent me for a memoir. "Your story could be the next Educated or The Glass Castle," she wrote, referencing best-selling memoirs of difficult childhoods. "You have everything: family dysfunction, financial success, despite the odds, a journey to self-actualization. This could be huge." A speakers bureau wanted to book me for corporate events and women's conferences with fees starting at $20,000 per appearance. "Companies are very interested in resilience narratives and boundary setting," the representative explained. "You could have a whole second career in motivational speaking." A smaller production company wanted to option my story for a limited series. "We're thinking something in the vein of Big Little Lies, prestige drama, complex female characters, family secrets. Very HBO." Each offer came with financial incentives that would have been significant earlier in my life. Each promised to amplify my message and help more people. Each framed itself as an opportunity for healing, closure, impact. And to each I said no. Not because the opportunities were inherently wrong, but because they weren't right for me. I'd shared my story once carefully through a journalist I trusted, who handled it with integrity. That had accomplished what I'd hoped it had: reached people who needed to hear it and given them permission to make their own choices about toxic families. But I didn't need to build a platform around my trauma. I didn't need to become the face of family estrangement or the poster child for setting boundaries. My professional identity was already established in a field I'd worked decades to build. My personal life was finally blessedly private and peaceful. Saying yes to these opportunities would mean reopening wounds I'd carefully tended. It would mean making my family dysfunctions central to my identity rather than just one chapter of a much larger story. It would mean performing the worst period of my life over and over again, for audiences who would consume it, be moved by it for a moment, and then scroll on to the next piece of trauma content. More than that, it would violate something fundamental I'd learned about healing. Real healing happened in private. It happened in therapy sessions where I cried without an audience. It happened in quiet mornings where I woke up without anxiety. It happened in friendships where I practiced vulnerability without expecting it to be rewarded or witnessed. It happened in the small daily choices to put myself first, to honor my boundaries, to build a life I didn't need to escape from. None of that required a platform. None of that needed validation from strangers. None of that was improved by being televised, published, or dramatized. I thought about what success meant to me now and realized the definition had shifted completely from what I'd once believed. 10 years ago, success meant professional achievement, financial security, external markers of having made it. 5 years ago, it meant finally being seen and appreciated by my family. Now, success was waking up and feeling at peace. It was going an entire week without checking my phone anxiously for crisis messages that would never come. It was having dinner with friends and laughing genuinely fully present, rather than mentally preparing for the next family emergency. It was sleeping through the night. It was saying no without guilt. It was building relationships based on reciprocity rather than obligation. Success was internal integrity rather than external applause. It was the private knowledge that I'd chosen myself, protected myself, given myself the love and respect my family couldn't provide. It was the quiet satisfaction of living authentically, even when that authenticity meant disappointing people who thought family loyalty should supersede everything else. I didn't need my story to be a bestseller. I didn't need to be interviewed on morning shows or give TED Talks about resilience. I didn't need my trauma to be optioned for prestige television. I just needed to keep living the life I'd fought so hard to build, one where I was seen valued and free. Patricia called one evening after I'd declined another speaking opportunity. "You know, you could actually help a lot of people with these platforms," she said, not critically, but curiously. "I know. And maybe someday I will. But right now, I need my healing to be mine. I need my life to be private. I've spent 35 years being useful to others. I'm allowed to be selfish with this." "That's not selfish," she said. "That's self-preservation. There's a difference." And she was right. Protecting my peace, refusing to commodify my pain, choosing privacy over platform. None of that was selfish. It was the continuation of the same choice I'd made when I implemented no contact, choosing myself. Not every story needs an audience. Some truths are just for you. The year anniversary of no contact passed quietly. I noted the date not with ceremony but with simple awareness. I'd made it a full year, living entirely on my own terms, unencumbered by my family's dysfunction. The milestone felt less like an achievement and more like confirmation that the choice I'd made was sustainable, permanent right. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Cream-colored, thick paper, my name and address, written in handwriting, I recognized instantly, despite not having seen it in years. My mother's careful script, slightly shaky now with age, but unmistakably hers. I stood in my kitchen holding the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My attorney had clear instructions: emergency contact only through official channels. This wasn't emergency contact. This was a violation of the boundary, albeit a gentle one. I could throw it away unopened. I had every right to maintain the wall I'd built. But curiosity won over caution. I opened it carefully. The letter was 7 pages, handwritten on lined notebook paper, the kind my mother had always used for her grocery lists and reminder notes. The penmanship was neater than usual, as if she'd drafted this multiple times before committing to the final version. It began without preamble. "Brittany, I know you asked not to be contacted, and I've honored that for nearly a year. I'm writing this not because I expect a response, but because there are things I need to say, and I'm running out of time to say them. You deserve to hear them, even if you choose never to speak to me again." Sarah died on June 14, 1988. She was 3 years and 4 months old. I put her down for a nap at 1 o'clock. I thought I'd locked the sliding door to the backyard, but I hadn't. A friend from church called about organizing a bake sale, and we talked for 18 minutes. When I went to check on Sarah, her room was empty. I found her in the pool. The paramedics said she'd been underwater for at least 10 minutes. Nothing could be done. The police investigation cleared me. It was ruled an accidental drowning. The community was kind. People brought casseroles and said comforting things about accidents and God's will and how it could have happened to anyone. But I knew the truth. I'd been distracted. I'd failed at the most basic task of keeping my child safe. I killed my daughter through inattention. 2 years later, I became pregnant with you. I saw it as a second chance, a gift, perhaps even penance. I convinced myself you were meant to replace what I'd lost, to heal what was broken. But when you were born and began to grow, you looked exactly like her. The same face, the same expressions, the same gestures. And instead of healing me, you reopened the wound every single day. Every time I looked at you, I saw Sarah. Every milestone you reached reminded me of milestones she'd never have. Your first day of kindergarten, your graduation, your career success. All of it felt like evidence of what I'd stolen from her. I couldn't separate you from my guilt. I couldn't love you without drowning in grief. I know now that I should have sought help. Therapy, medication, something. But I was raised in a generation that didn't believe in those things, and I was ashamed. So I did what I'd always done. I pretended to be fine, and buried everything that hurt. And in burying my grief, I buried you too. Madeline was born 8 years later. She looked like your father. She carried no ghosts. With her, I could be the mother I'd wanted to be with you but couldn't. The favoritism wasn't fair, and it wasn't intentional in the way you might think. It was just easier. She didn't remind me of my greatest failure. You had every right to leave. The letter continued with specific acknowledgments. The trust fund theft, the public humiliation, the years of neglect, disguised as believing I was fine on my own. She didn't make excuses, but she did provide context, the kind of brutal honesty I'd never heard from her before. The final page was shorter. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to contact me or resume any relationship. You've built a life without me, and from what I understand, it's a good one. I'm glad for that. I'm glad you escaped what I couldn't give you. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see the harm. I see that it was never about you, and I'm sorry you paid the price for my inability to heal. You were innocent. You are innocent. You always were. Mom. I read the letter 3 times. The first reading brought shock. This level of self-awareness was something I'd never witnessed from my mother. The second brought sadness, not for our relationship, but for the waste of it all, the decades lost to unprocessed trauma. The third brought something unexpected relief. For years, a small voice in my head had whispered doubts. Maybe you're too harsh. Maybe you're remembering it worse than it was. Maybe you're being unforgiving. Maybe you're the problem. The letter silenced that voice completely. Here in my mother's own handwriting was confirmation that my perception had been accurate. The cruelty was real. The favoritism was real. The emotional neglect was real. I hadn't imagined it, hadn't exaggerated, it hadn't been too sensitive or too demanding. I considered responding. I drafted 3 different replies in my head, ranging from acknowledgement to continued boundary setting to gratitude for the honesty. But ultimately, I filed the letter away in my safe deposit box alongside my grandmother's letter and the trust fund documents. The letter wasn't an invitation to reconnect. It was my mother's attempt to unburden herself. Before it was too late, she was 63, not elderly but aware of mortality in the way people become after a spouse dies. She'd said what she needed to say. I didn't need to absolve her or thank her or engage further. The silence I maintained wasn't hostile. It was simply the continuation of the boundary I'd set. Some things didn't require response. Some truths could stand alone without dialogue or reciprocation. What shifted wasn't my relationship with my mother that remained severed and appropriately so. What shifted was my relationship with my own doubt. The last lingering question about whether I'd been too hard, too unforgiving, too quick to burn bridges evaporated completely. The truth arrived too late to change anything but just in time to set me free. 14 months. That's how long it had been since I'd last spoken to anyone in my family. The number arrived quietly in my consciousness one morning in late November as I made coffee in the kitchen of the apartment I'd moved to when everything began. The space looked nothing like it had that first night when I'd stood at the mirror questioning whether anyone would notice my absence. The beige walls were now painted a warm gray-blue. Art hung in carefully chosen spots, a watercolor I'd painted myself, a print I'd found at a local gallery, a photograph of a hiking trail I'd conquered with my weekend group. Plants lined the windowsill, thriving under attention I'd never had energy to give them before. Books were stacked on surfaces mid-read and loved. The apartment wasn't just functional anymore. It was home. Thanksgiving was 3 days away. In previous years, this would have been a time of mounting anxiety, dreading the family dinner, preparing myself for subtle digs and obvious favoritism, wondering what crisis would erupt and require my intervention. Now the holiday brought only pleasant anticipation. I was hosting Friendsgiving for 7 people, a mix of friends and colleagues who, for various reasons, weren't spending the day with blood relatives. Patricia was bringing wine. Sarah was handling the turkey. I'd volunteered for sides and dessert. We'd turned meal planning into a group text thread full of jokes and recipe debates. The gathering wouldn't be traditional or Norman Rockwell perfect. It would be loud and chaotic and full of people who'd chosen to be there, who wanted to be there, who saw each other clearly and loved what they saw. That felt more valuable than any blood tie. But as I set out serving dishes and folded napkins, I felt the familiar tug of complicated grief. It arrived less frequently now, these moments of dual awareness where peace and sadness coexisted without canceling each other out. I was happy, genuinely deeply happy in ways I'd never been when I was still enmeshed with my family. I loved my life, loved my freedom, loved waking up without dread. I didn't regret leaving, not for a second. And I was also sad. Sad about what could have been if my mother had been capable of healing. Sad about the childhood I deserved and never got. Sad about the sister relationship Madeline and I might have had if we hadn't been pitted against each other. Sad about family holidays that would never be warm or joyful or safe. Both truths lived in me simultaneously. Some days choosing myself felt like pure victory, evidence of strength and self-respect I'd earned through hard work. Other days it felt like survival, like I'd had to amputate a diseased limb to save the rest of my body. Most days it was both. I'd learned that closure wasn't a destination. It wasn't a single conversation or revelation that tied everything up neatly. It was an ongoing process, a choice I made every day to honor my boundaries, to protect my peace, to choose my well-being over guilt or obligation or the fantasy of reconciliation. Some days that choice was easy. Other days it was excruciating, but it was always mine. I walked to my bedroom and opened the drawer of my nightstand, where I kept things that mattered: my grandmother's letter, my mother's recent acknowledgement, and the photograph of Sarah I'd found over a year ago. I took out Sarah's picture and studied her face, so eerily similar to my own. For months after discovering the photo, I'd kept it on my dresser, a constant reminder of the ghost I'd been forced to embody. But after my mother's letter, after understanding the full scope of the tragedy, the photo had taken on different meaning. I held it gently, speaking aloud to the sister I'd never known, but whose shadow had defined my entire life. I'm sorry you didn't get to grow up. I'm sorry Mom couldn't separate her grief from her love. I'm sorry your death became my burden to carry. I paused, feeling the weight of what I wanted to say next. But I won't live your unlived life by sacrificing mine. I won't shrink or disappear or accept less than I deserve because Mom couldn't heal. You deserved better. And so do I. I placed the photo back in the drawer, not discarded or destroyed, but no longer on display. The past was real and acknowledged, but it didn't define my present anymore. Sarah's story was tragic, and I honored that. But it was her story, not mine. I'd spent 35 years being confused with a ghost. I was done with that now. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Bringing an extra bottle of wine and my famous cranberry sauce. Can't wait for tomorrow. I smiled, typing back a quick response, then returned to my kitchen to check on the pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. Tomorrow this apartment would be full of laughter and conversation and people who chose to be here with me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That was the family I'd built. That was the love I'd earned. That was the life I'd fought for. It wasn't perfect. I still had moments of loneliness, still grappled with the cultural shame of being estranged, still sometimes wondered if I'd done the right thing. But those moments were getting fewer and farther between, eclipsed by days and weeks of genuine contentment. I'd built a life on my own terms. Messy, imperfect, sometimes lonely, but authentically mine. I woke up without anxiety. I made decisions based on what I wanted, not what others needed. I surrounded myself with people who saw me, truly saw me, and loved what they saw. The apartment that had once been a hiding place was now a sanctuary. The freedom that had once felt terrifying now felt like air. The choice that had once felt like betrayal now felt like the most honest thing I'd ever done. I chose myself. Some days that feels like victory. Other days it feels like survival. Most days it's both, and that's okay. Brittany's story isn't just about leaving a toxic family. It's about understanding that love without respect is not love at all. Her mother and sister faced the consequences of their choices. Madeline struggling with debts no one would cover her mother alone with the truth she could no longer deny. But Brittany didn't find satisfaction in their suffering. She found freedom in her own peace. The real victory wasn't revenge. It was building a life where she was finally seen valued and whole. To every woman watching who has ever felt invisible in her own family, who has given until there was nothing left, who has been told that setting boundaries makes her selfish, your worth is not measured by how much you sacrifice. Choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's survival. It's dignity. It's the most honest act of love you can offer yourself. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen.